Where other men blindly follow the truth, remember,
Nothing is true.
where other men are limited by morality and law, remember, everything is permitted.
This video is going to be an absolute journey, but I want to start with how it's going to end. The video game Assassin's Creed Shadows, the latest installment in the Assassin's Creed series that has undergone something of a reputation shift ever since it rebooted with Assassin's Creed Origins after the developers wrote out the follow-up to the plot of Assassin's Creed Syndicate in the Assassin's Creed Uprising comic series, has been a subject of much discussion online. I'm not a huge comics person, but I am familiar with the main Assassin's Creed games, the original series in particular, as well as the book series tie-ins, and I've been wanting to write about these on my channel for some time. However, I haven't stayed caught up on the newer games, and have been streaming my playthroughs of the older games to catch up on the series. I wasn't a huge fan of how the Juno plotline sort of seemed like it got abandoned by Ubisoft in favor of rebooting the series to lean into a more RPG-style game. I don't like when video game developers follow obvious industry trends. I've written about this in videos for my patrons at patreon.com, but suffice it to say that executives at video game companies prefer to think in quantifiable terms. Engaging storytelling is a big watchword of the industry, but what this means to devs and players is something very different to what it means to executives. Listening to executives talk and hearing from developers about what it's like to deal with executives gives the impression that to corporate suits, storytelling tends to be a macro-level event, unironically a bit like the fluff around the metaverse, for which there's a great Folding Ideas video that I'll link in the description. Storytelling, from many corporate executives, seems to be just a buzzword for player experience at the macro level. A player's story isn't just their engagement with a particular narrative, but also their engagement with the material across specific narratives, their association with the product. Next time you hear an executive use the phrase "your story," or "players and their stories," pay attention to the context and maybe you'll see what I mean. Executives think in terms of numbers, not just revenue, cost and profit, but also numbers internal to the games, number of quests, amount of space, average playtime, number of in-game items, number of NPCs, number of game copies purchased, and how these numbers form other numbers signifying trends. I hate the way the games industry works. There are serious problems, and usually these involve manipulation by major corporations that seriously affects the lives of people who work on games. But there's another trend that's been occurring in some measure over the past decade or so that's been eating away at gaming spaces online. This behavior occurs in trends too directed to be incidental and too consistent to not have real causes. It has certain hallmarks. You'll see people directing pretty extreme negativity at current developers of newer games, even as they claim to be fans of earlier games made in large part by many of the same people. You'll see outright misinformation and hateful remarks, a lot of which purport to be apolitical or motivated by non-political sentiment, despite affirming the sentiments of existing political movements. But above all, you'll see people aggressively brute force this sentiment into spaces that are, in some sense, neutral and for everybody, into communities that didn't previously have the hallmarks of politically motivated or toxic behavior. A recent clip of a live streamer got some traction in gaming spaces I participate in, and you might recognize this guy as Fightin' Cowboy, mostly known for previewing, critiquing, and above all creating very helpful guides about games he plays for his audience.
Listen, I can already tell people in chat are getting a little feisty. Bro, stop. Stop. We're gonna put you in timeout for like a day. There's no reason to be making comments like that. I'm gonna make this clear. If you're just coming here to get into this weird fucking race shit about a historical figure that existed in Japanese history, I'm just gonna remove you. And guess what? That means you ain't gonna be around for Kazan or Night Rain or AI Limit or any of that shit. I don't give a fuck what your opinion is of this game. I don't care. Your opinion is worthless to me. The quality of health of my morning shit had a bigger impact on my thought process today than you being upset that there's a black guy in Assassin's Creed. So shut the fuck up. All right? We're not doing this shit. It's a fucking video game. If you are upset that there's a black guy in a video game, fuck off. I don't want you here. I don't care. Stop. I'm not doing this fucking argument. Every goddamn game these days. Oh, it's woke. Oh, there's a black guy. Oh, there's a trans person. Shut the fuck up. Either play the game or go the fuck outside, bro. It's not that hard. God damn. I've been on this earth 37 fucking years. When I was a kid, guess what? If a game came out and I didn't want to get involved with it, I didn't fucking play with it. I didn't go on the internet and cry like an entitled little child, wah, 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 wah. The game doesn't have stuff that I want. So shut the fuck up and leave, bro. Are you that much of a fucking loser that you're seeking out streams of a game you don't like just to be like, wah, I don't like this. There's a black guy. Shut the fuck up. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. That's all. This is the only rant. I'm getting this shit out of the way now. Stop. Because any comment, any fucking comment, I'm just gonna ban you. I don't care. I'm just gonna fucking ban you. I don't care. I don't have time for it, bro. I'm here to play a fucking game, not listen to you cry about a black dude that existed in history that was brought over to Japan as a slave and then taken on by Nobunaga and made a fucking retainer. All right. If that upsets you, if that makes you not feel like you're in your special place, that's not my fucking problem. Go talk to your therapist about it.
I feel a lot of sympathy for Fightin' Cowboy, not just because I disagree with the people making some of those remarks, but because he did not ask for this just by virtue of being a gaming content creator. It is not fair to go into the community of someone like that and slam them with that kind of negativity. I don't know if this is going to be considered me reverse white knighting or whatever, but I also don't care because this is ridiculous. I have my own political views, but I don't spam them in the chats and comment sections of people who aren't even making content geared towards political commentary. That's obnoxious, and anyone with minimal social graces could tell you it would be unwelcome. That stream was on March 18th, 2 days before the release of the game, and on March 21st, Fightin' Cowboy did a short follow-up stream talking about this, where he had some interesting things to say.
So what actually happened is we had people that were upset about a black guy on the screen, and they were called out. They were called out live, and that needs to happen more. Now, why did I get so fucking angry? Let's talk about it. Because, bro, it's obnoxious. It's obnoxious. I mean, like, for real, let's talk about the last year in gaming. Fucking Stellar Blade drama. Because there was a titty window added. Oh, they're censoring. They're taking away the gooning. Elden Ring drama. Because, oh, they hid it behind a boss. They hid it behind a fucking boss and it's too expensive. Fucking, let me actually, I could probably come up with drama for every fucking game we had, I bet. Let me pull up a playlist of the last year. Stalker 2, people were upset just because the fact that it was a Ukrainian studio, so that got a bunch of shit. Dragon Age, people were upset that there was a character who went by they, them in the game, so that got a bunch of shit. We had fucking Avowed, which came out. People were upset about Avowed because the existence of pronouns was offensive. We had people that were upset about KCD because there was a single gay relationship you could have in the game. And now people are upset about Shadows because there's gay stuff and a black guy. And honestly, and this is the fun thing. This is the fun thing, right? If y'all have friends that don't watch streams, if y'all have friends that just play video games, they don't fuck with social media, ask them about this shit. Be like, yo, did you hear about the Stellar Blade drama? Did you hear about the Assassin's Creed drama? And most of them are going to be like, what are you talking about? Is the game, is it bad? And you're like, no, there's a black samurai and you can bang Nobunaga's sister. They're going to look like Walter White in that Breaking Bad meme where they're like, Jesse, what the fuck are you talking about? Normal people don't get upset about this shit. Okay? This is a manufactured issue in the online space by grifters.
The link to the full video is in the description. He had a lot more to say, and I think it's relevant, But I just wanted to show this clip and open with this because it's relevant to the issue to start on one particular note. Games matter, gaming matters, the arts in general matter, these communities matter, and there's a lot of stuff being directed at these spaces or promoted at the expense of these spaces that, far from being okay, is actually pretty destructive to the ability of people to exist there. I like hanging out in gaming spaces. Very rarely do I ever make a comment, and when I do, it's mostly about the game or something fun that happened. If I'm making politically oriented remarks, they're in the context of my own content or the content others have made about those specific issues. It's a gray area, nobody's perfect, etc., etc., but the point is to try your best when keeping good boundaries. That's it. As a small footnote here, I'd like to say that Fightin' Cowboy isn't the only one noticing the, shall we say, tourist attraction that is the Assassin's Creed Shadows discourse. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a fan of the series, although I've at times had a love-hate relationship with parts of it. I own 4 out of the 5 newer games, with the exception of Shadows, as well as the original Assassin's Creed, Brotherhood, Revelations, AC3, Black Flag, Rogue, Unity, and I think Syndicate. I own 18 of the novels, which, believe it or not, isn't all of them. I don't want to act like I'm the biggest fan here. I'm still working my way through some of them and playing catch-up, but you get the point. I do actually care about these games for reasons besides just clicks and attention. Someday we'll share more of them together, I hope. But when people who actually care speak up, in other words, when real fans, a phrase that gets thrown around by very entitled people, are actually present in the conversation for once when a new thing is getting called woke, they get attacked. I saw a video from The Hidden One, a YouTuber who makes a lot of Assassin's Creed content covering the games, going over the ways that people pushing the controversy have just gotten stuff wrong. For this, a lot of people had some really not great responses, although I think the majority of Assassin's Creed fans aren't, like, insane racists, so a lot seem to and probably do support him using his voice on the issue. Link, as always, is in the description. I think creators like this who don't normally speak up about this content choosing to do so is meaningful, even if it isn't really what they tend to care about, or at least what they tend to dedicate their time to making. I guess the point, to my mind, should be to keep our communities relatively clean, like picking up trash off the street by your house. When I was at college, I used to do that because I lived at this apartment near some bars in a busy street, where people would march at homecoming, and busy weekends and stuff like that, there would always be a bunch of litter. Maybe you're an environmentalist, maybe you just don't like seeing it there. That was how I felt. Or maybe you know it's damaging to the area you live in and that's what you care about. But when they do speak up, they will get a ton of crap for it, and that seems to be by design. It's worth asking what happened here and why, I think. I had noticed a lot of this stuff as it was ongoing, but here's a series of clips from prominent content creators, the ringleaders of these, frankly, harassment campaigns against both fans and developers, as well as against historians and really anyone willing to argue against them.
DEI propaganda video game Assassin's Creed Shadows has been delayed once again because of course it has. The original release date for this game was November of last year. They delayed that to February of 2025, and now it's being pushed to March. And they're claiming that it's allowing them to get all of the positive feedback from the Assassin's Creed community. Okay, yeah, we believe that. Assassin's Creed Shadows release date delayed again as Ubisoft prepares for potential sale. This is over from Variety. And it says, shifting from the February 14th to March 20th, the delay will allow the team to better incorporate the player feedback gathered over the past 3 months and help create the best conditions for launch by continuing to engage closely with the increasingly positive Assassin's Creed community. Oh, really?
And from the moment they started promoting this, it was met with a significant amount of backlash, and for a good reason, deciding to include Yasuke, the fictional Black Samurai, the mythical Black Samurai, as a playable character in the first Assassin's Creed game ever set in Japan, not only didn't sit very well with the people of Japan, but it also didn't sit very well with virtually everybody who may have been looking forward to playing this game. And they made their voices heard. As you can see, twice as many dislikes as likes in the official world premiere trailer for Assassin's Creed Shadows 9 months ago.
Let's have a brief interlude before continuing. I wish Ryan Kinnell would learn not to speak in run-on sentences. I know it's petty of me, but figuring out how to transcribe that guy is such a nightmare. It's like his brain reboots every 20 syllables or so. I've picked these segments out of these videos because I think they demonstrate a few points in rapid succession. First, you saw Jeremy of the channel Geeks and Gamers cast some strong aspersions on the sincerity of Ubisoft's statement. This doesn't make much sense in the context of his argument that the future financial success of Ubisoft could be tenuous, since delaying for a better launch would benefit the company if that were true. But what he really wants to do is shift over to blue checkmark grifter accounts in the replies on Twitter, as if those people represent the Assassin's Creed fanbase. Ryan Kindle does the same thing by appealing to the like to dislike ratio of the trailer uploaded to YouTube. It's very clear what these guys are collectively doing. Putting their finger on the scale to create backlash, and then gesturing and saying, "Whoa, the fans hate this." One of the things you'll notice about these clips is the tendency to obsess over predicting the financial success of the game. This is part of the larger tendency to say, "Get woke, go broke." A lot of these figures seem to, if I'm being charitable, exist in opposition to conventional games journalism and its problems, something we'll discuss later. But the effect this has on their rhetoric is that it has conditioned both them and their audiences to speak about the arts chiefly in terms of profit. They make a lot of predictions, many of which fail to come true, about how films or games will lose money. Sometimes books tend to get left out of this equation. I wonder why, she said facetiously. I've noticed this as a larger cultural problem, even extending to comments I tend to get. Very occasionally, people talk about the videos I make about culture and the arts as if the main or sole purpose of these commentaries is to tell you first if something is good or bad, and subsequently if you should buy it. I shouldn't have to say this, but I don't make product reviews. The only channels that do those kinds of ratings that I actually watch are probably Mortismal Gaming or Iron Pineapple. Otherwise, I stick to checking out gameplay from streamers and looking at sales for things to try.
Because usually the really woke progressive crowd cry bloody murder when you have something that's depicting a more diverse setting, like say if it was in Africa or sometimes in Asia and stuff like that, and if the protagonist is white, there's a phrase that they usually use to describe if the protagonist is white. Have you heard it before?
Is it white savior?
White savior.
Yeah.
They call it the white savior trope, right? And I have had little care if the main character is white, based in an Asian thing. Like The Last Samurai had, a white main character, right? But they're the ones who have cried bloody murder at stuff like this. Like, you need to represent and have the main character from the culture.
Yeah.
And so according to their own standard, this seems a little hypocritical.
It does.
It does. They are latching onto this, historical figure and then inflating his role.
Yes.
To a much larger degree, it seems, than he was in the past. And we know why. It's very obvious to see why. It's for the DEI stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely copping a lot of flack as well for like the things like the romance angles, where, as I understand it, there's like 4 different romances you can pursue in this. One of them is a heterosexual romance, and the other 3 are either gay or with a non-binary character.
Yeah.
Which is wow, that's quite a weighting there.
Ubisoft has an option in the game called canon mode. You turn that on, and then you don't have to make any decisions in the game anymore. The game makes all the decisions for you in terms of this is like the canon choices. So canon mode choice-wise, Now Wei is lesbian canon. That's just, if you put it on, that's what she becomes.
She is.
Of course she is.
Wait, what's Mahler doing there? Kidding. What to say about this? There's an old evergreen tweet from the official Doom account back when it was advertising Doom Eternal that I think about in times like this. You control the buttons you press. If you don't want to be gay, stop having gay relationships. Wait, hang on, I've got another one. Why do all these homosexuals keep sucking my cock? Endymion is doing his best in that clip to put some spin on it, but it just isn't working. He's supposedly played this, and ostensibly so is the drinker, so why does he keep getting the romance info wrong? Why does nobody correct him? It's 6 romances, 1 male homosexual, 1 non-binary, 1 female homosexual, and 3 heterosexual. 1 for Yasuke, 2 for Naoe. Does the drinker think all sex with women is gay? Did Nick Fuentes sit in on this livestream? Like seriously, you would have to want to be lied to, or otherwise you'd have to have never played these games in order to buy into this narrativization. You have romance options. You can be in a same-sex relationship or opposite-sex relationship. This really seems like a skill issue. Stop pretending that the game makes you into a lesbian. Only Assassin's Creed Odyssey can do that, and that's purely by virtue of being a woman looking at Cassandra. Cover your eyes, girls. I also like Shadiversity pretending to not be invested in this, as if this isn't his whole grift now. Again, you have the option to play as a black character. You also have the option to play as a Japanese character. I hate to be the one saying this, because usually I find this really obnoxious, but it straight up is not that deep. Also, small nitpick, but you know Shad's racist because he describes a non-white majority setting as more diverse. More diverse than what, dude? A clan rally? It's literally another culture. If anything, there are many places in Japan that are less diverse than many places in America. That's just a bullshit euphemism. It's not even a case of the white savior trope unless the white person is literally the hero saving everyone. That's also a role. Being a white person present in a majority non-white population is not itself the white savior trope. What, are you now too lazy to read TV tropes too? You didn't even need to get this wrong. You could have argued your point better if you knew what those words meant. Whatever, moving on.
I gotta be honest here. I didn't really think I could see Ubisoft falling any lower than they already had in the past couple of months, but here I am, being surprised once again. I really shouldn't be at this point the way they've been going, but between sending C&Ds to YouTubers and then striking channels that happen to show leaked videos of their botched games injected with DEI, and that's their fault for leaking them, but yet somehow it's the YouTubers' fault for discussing it, that's neither here nor there, because moving on, they have now moved to combine their powers with the Canadian government, team up together to fight against hate speech, harassment, and protecting their employees, or at least that's what they're using to hide behind all of this. But what's really happening is they want to curb any kind of criticism against Assassin's Creed Shadows.
So this broke over on some French website, and Kotaku got a hold of it. Of course, Ethan Gach, the guy that loves canceling people, reported on it. And this is basically the gist of what was over on the French site. A French news network, BFM TV, now reports that developers at Ubisoft Quebec who worked on the game have been advised not to post about it on social media to avoid becoming targets of the harassment campaign. What is that? Is that just people going, LOL, your game's not selling well? Or why did you do this or that? See, they're going to go with the extreme, and some schizo who says, you know, I want to end you or something is made the example for everybody. That's what they're all getting. They're all getting this kind of behavior when it's really just people laughing and posting memes, usually.
Smash JT is such a dumb guy, dude. No wonder he's in over his head with that lawsuit over his harassment of Alyssa Mercante. This guy holds his right to harass people as a first-order value. But he really should, you know, brush up on how this all works. What do you mean it's Ubisoft's fault for leaking their games? The company didn't authorize it, dum-dum, that's why it's called a leak. Are you stupid? Don't answer that. The rest of this video's premise is that Ubisoft wants to sue people if they harass the developers in any legally actionable capacity, and Smash JT says that's like wanting to sue gamers over criticism. I guess depending on your point of view, if your criticism is that people shouldn't be black, I could maybe see the barest thread of a criminal defense there, but not necessarily a civil one. Just don't harass the devs. That's pretty easy, right? Talk about the game on its own terms. Don't send anyone hate mail or replies with slurs and stuff, and you're good to go. I do that every day. Every day of my life I'm not harassing people who make games I don't like. Look at me go. You can do it too. I believe in you. Honestly, I think YouTube's busted copyright system and inconsistently enforced terms of service are the real issue here, both of which make it easier for corporations, and of course, guys like you, to do the actual bullying that happens on this platform. My favorite part of every Smash JT video is the part where his run-on sentences sort of start to derail and crash into each other like Omni-Man just knocking them off the tracks. He and Ryan Kinnell should start a support group for guys whose gray matter overheats like a crappy 2000s era laptop trying to run Skyrim with a million texture mods. I don't know who these guys are kidding, because Joe Biden really was their president. That's representation right there. Of course, if you're asking if they're just dumb or lying, the answer is basically both. This media environment that they operate in requires liars, but curates doofuses. Yellow Flash is just as dishonest, but what's important is that these guys are kind of doing two halves of the same thing. I showed earlier the strategy of people like Jeremy Griggs and Ryan Kinnell using weighted numbers to try to claim their movement represents the real fans. And now with that perception in place, their toxicity gets rhetorically offloaded by people like Smash JT and Yellow Flash onto the real, actual fandom for the series. And then they act like the developers are the ones targeting the fans. Nah, man, you guys are targeting the fans by scapegoating us for your behavior. I want to be clear about something before we wrap up. Just because these people are all career liars doesn't mean I think I will enjoy the game, would recommend it, or think it necessarily deserves to be reviewed well. What I want to demonstrate here is bigger than all that. These people, these creators, I mean, who manipulate with rhetoric to cultivate discourse cycles that toxify these spaces, are just not being honest with you. Actually, to add one more to the pile, Asmongold has been pumping out a metric crap ton of slop react, where he watches a video and then repeats what was just said to his audience, or does the Tucker Carlson resting confusion face at the camera. Don't worry though, I'm not going to make my audience sit through more than one Asmongold clip. Be ready for that later, because it's a real doozy, just you wait, and it's coming somewhere in the next, holy hell, 2 hours and counting? Who let me make this? Who could have stopped me from doing this and didn't?
KKK, neo-Nazi.
Those people don't like me.
Are you
to be
like
honest.
the hipster version of the neo-Nazi movement?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
We've taken liberties thus far to examine how this discourse broke containment as well as why that is. But there's another dimension of this discussion that I've left open. Actually, there are a few, and I'm going to challenge myself this time to try to get 100% of my thoughts out in one essay so as to feel like I've said my piece on this. This game keeps getting called woke or DEI, and I want to talk about those words, their relevance to this situation, and the purpose of even caring about that stuff at all. I want to expand the content of this conversation beyond merely responding to individual creators and criticizing the movements to which these creators contribute and the mindsets of the members of these movements and the fans orbiting these content cycles. Yeah, I know, this is that part of the video essay, but just bear with me and I promise I'll surprise you with something later on, I guarantee it. Wokeness, meanwhile, traditionally and up until basically the late 2010s, referred to being aware of social injustices, especially on race issues, but also sometimes issues understood as intersecting with race issues, like issues of gender or class. You can get this from a lot of different art created by Black Americans. One example that will come up later in this essay is Jordan Peele's Get Out, which, because I actually saw it in theaters when it came out, I know for a fact features a Childish Gambino track called which, to avoid using a slur that isn't really in my vernacular, I'll paraphrase here as, "Stay woke, N-words creeping, they gon' find you, they gon' catch you sleeping." Obviously he says the word, and not the phrase N-words, but you get the point. Is he talking about white people here? Probably not entirely, but the song clearly contains allusions to multi-ethnic and biracial identities or light-skinned black people, depending on your interpretation of the title, as well as romance and sexuality and potentially injustices perpetrated at the expense of the singer's object of affection. To simplify it, I think one easy interpretation is that the song is about being a good guy with unrequited love. It's a pretty good song, I think. But what's important here is that there's some range, conventionally, and even recently, in Black culture, to the idea of what it means to be woke. It's not strictly about racial issues, but that's a lot of the context and the history. This is how I use the word, because when I'm in somebody else's culture, I might be able to participate, but I'm also a guest. I need to be ready to learn. I made a video about what it means to be against wokeness in gaming, and how there was a game series that I thought was conventionally woke, and some people took issue with that. In a vacuum, that's fine, but what I really couldn't stand about this was the exasperation that people had as if it's so obvious that I must be wrong about this, when I'm using a pretty standard and established definition for this word. I own that it's my rhetoric, because while I think it is important to be deferential to groups of which I am not a part when speaking to issues they face, I also think it's important as a person who doesn't face those issues to own my own rhetoric. I can learn from Black culture, but I do not represent it. If I say something, ideally it's because I'm learning and observing, but those are my words, and therefore only I can take ownership of them. As an example of how this word woke should be used and what I meant by all that, consider the following. Dragon Age Origins, the first game in the Dragon Age series, contains multiple backgrounds which the player can not only select but also play through as effectively tutorial levels. They are your first quests. The Dwarven noble background involves family betrayal and scheming for power, painting the upper class in a certain light. The Dwarven commoner background involves a similar class-specific struggle, this time upwardly mobile instead of downwardly mobile. Both have examples of unequal gender relations, either in your brother's mistress or your sister's history as a sex worker. The human noble background is actually quite similar to the Dwarven noble background as I've described it. The mage background involves spiritual dangers, as well as those imposed on mages by the Templar Order. The elvish backgrounds are in some ways the most woke, since they draw direct attention to the race-based disenfranchisement of the Dalish elves and the race-based and class-based sexual victimization of elvish women in human cities, depending on which of the two backgrounds you choose. Hopefully, you're picking up what I'm putting down. I could easily have made another identical video here, something like Assassin's Creed was always woke. I wanted to do something different creatively, as you'll soon see. There would be a strong argument for that position, however. The series opens with a conspiracy plot, such an obvious and blatant exploration of hidden social injustice that it barely needs explaining. The story of Ezio Auditore in both Assassin's Creed II and Assassin's Creed Brotherhood features injustices perpetrated by the Catholic Church. Assassin's Creed III features obvious colonial injustices. Assassin's Creed IV Black Flag features a conflict between privateers trying to be free from European rule and the class-based state crackdown on those groups. Assassin's Creed Unity and Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Do I really have to explain why stuff like the French Revolution and opposition to the English crown would be considered woke? You get it, right? Some of these games did big numbers, and are even referred to by many as a time when Assassin's Creed was better than it is now. Wokeness, clearly, obviously, has little to no correlation with financial success. I'd like you to note here how euphemistic a lot of the use cases of woke by grifters really is. I don't really have a problem with euphemisms in the abstract. They can be used to be sensitive to the feelings of others when social graces are especially necessary. However, that's the conventional use of euphemisms for the sake of politeness. These people euphemize terminology in the same way, but they do it to hide their odious views. In that sense, what we're talking about is dog whistling. You see this all the time. People will call a woman pure when they mean to call her chaste or demure. People will call black people thugs when they mean to associate blackness with criminality. People will say groomer when they mean to just refer to somebody who is gay or transgender, or otherwise conveys to children the, I think, obviously true point that there's nothing wrong with being gay or transgender. I was transgender when I was a kid. I was gay when I was a kid. Those messages can be helpful. But the more I noticed that bigoted people will hide what they mean to slip their views into more mainstream discourses, the more I saw how dishonest these people really are. In this case, there's a few uses for terms like woke or DEI, traditionally an acronym meaning diversity, equity, and inclusion, that exists as anti-discrimination policy in institutions, chiefly business, education, and government. Lately, this term, like affirmative action years ago, has become a lightning rod for one particular behavior, the rhetorical association of privilege with competence. Usually this occurs in these cases along racial lines, but euphemistically, people, and especially white racists, will use these terms to insinuate that a person, usually a black person, has a position for reasons other than their competence. Conspiracies around this have actually motivated entire careers of national-level conservative grifters like Charlie Kirk, whose original claim to fame was saying that he lost a position at West Point Military Academy because a black person got in due to affirmative action. This was Kirk's story for years when he was starting up Turning Point USA, and it's full of holes. In an article for The New Yorker, Jane Mayer writes that, quote, in a 2015 speech to the Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley, he said that his #1 dream in life was to attend West Point, but the slot he considered his went to, quote, a far less qualified candidate of a different gender and a different persuasion, end quote, whose test scores he claimed he knew. Kirk said he was being sarcastic when he made the comment, end quote, which I am sure is true. Not the sarcasm part, but I'm sure he said that. He would have to, given he's lying. The idea that West Point Military Academy would publish or pass off student test scores or transcripts on the down low to some rich kid is patently absurd. What's also absurd, and what a lot of conservatives buying Kirk's story will tactically fail to notice, is the proposition that there are reserved slots at West Point that are given away. It's not a theater you can buy a ticket for that saves you a seat. You do actually have to get in on the merit of your scores. If you didn't get in, it's because somebody else did just as well, or better. But that's not the only problem. According to an article for Politico by Joseph Quinto, Kirk founded Turning Point USA one day after he graduated high school. He was so ready to do anything other than go to college, he didn't even seemingly have a real backup plan for West Point, nor did he seem altogether dedicated to getting in by reapplying, if he ever applied at all. This article is full of a lot of great pieces of information about Turning Point USA, and clearly shows how much of a make-work program for resentful young white people, financed by the insanely wealthy oligarchs of America, this really is. You can maybe start to see the ghost of a pattern here. Insist you're entitled to something you barely seem to care about, go out of your way to seek attention in pursuit of right-wing money, and enjoy your massive career with maximum attention and minimum effort. It's the Tim Pool playbook all over again, and you remember that. Try to hold that one in your head for the next few minutes. As something of a POC myself, a person of competence that is, it's frustrating to see how much incompetence gets rewarded by conservative dollars. These people have basically done, as per usual, the thing they're accusing others of doing, this time by creating a miniature media industrial complex for people who say the right things. This stuff is so obviously astroturfed that you'd have to be a very different kind of POC, a pissed-off conservative, to have any appreciation for it. Of course, DEI has another euphemistic use case here, representation, and this is really what these people are so fixated on with Yasuke. It's important to note that fans of video games and video game content creators who actually care about the content of games and engaging with them sincerely, like Fightin' Cowboy or The Hidden One, just for two examples, aren't the only ones talking about this either. I saw this great TikTok that covered this issue of representing Yasuke in this game, Assassin's Creed Shadows, super well, and I'll share that with you here.
Oh no, a black samurai on the new Assassin's Creed? Japanese here, sit your white ass down. So I was scrolling on Instagram and saw this post. I went to the comment field and there were a lot of white men saying that this is cultural appropriation. And me, as a Japanese, thought, but Yasuke actually existed. So to make sure my fellow Japanese people are on the same side with me, I went to X and looked it up in Japanese. And yes, they were on my side, saying that Yasuke actually existed and it's funny that foreigners don't like it. Nobunaga named the slave Yasuke and gave him the status of bushi, and he made Yasuke his servant. So yeah, black samurai did exist. So it is not cultural appropriation.
To back up what she's saying, here's an incredibly even-handed article by Connor Murray of Forbes that went over this aspect of the issue quite well. Murray correctly identifies the objectors to the game along these lines of minority identity as conservative, and then goes on to give this accounting of the big ringleaders, quote, "The game's diverse character options have angered some critics who have slammed the game as woke, including the right-wing YouTuber Tim Pool, who posted a video to his 1.3 million subscribers calling it pandering to base a game in feudal Japan on a black character instead of a, quote, real Japanese hero in a Japanese time period." Several hosts associated with the conservative Daily Wire media organization also criticized the game, including Brett Cooper, who quipped to her 4 million YouTube subscribers that a black samurai is exactly what I think of when I think of feudal Japan. Ever cracked open a history book? Though she praised the look of the trailer and Yasuke's story, she suggested a Japanese main character would have been a better fit for a story set in Japan, and accused the game of vapid, empty representation. Daily Wire host Michael Knowles slammed the potential options for LGBTQ relationships, stating to his 2 million YouTube subscribers that he supported Yasuke as a character until Ubisoft made him gay. Some players took to X and the comment sections of Assassin's Creed Instagram posts to lament that the game's male protagonist is not Japanese. Murray also goes on to add that, quote, Yasuke is a real historical figure thought of by historians as the first black samurai. Though his exact origins are largely unknown, many historians believe he was from Mozambique, while others claim he may be from Ethiopia or Nigeria, BBC reported. Yasuke traveled to Japan with the Italian Jesuit missionary Alessandro Valignano in 1579, likely in service to him as a bodyguard, historian Thomas Lockley told Time. Yasuke and Valignano traveled to Kyoto in 1581, where Yasuke met the Japanese warlord Oda Nobunaga, known as one of the great unifiers of Japan. Nobunaga, who at first did not believe Yasuke's skin was black and ordered him scrubbed, recruited Yasuke into his army, impressed by his tall height and strong stature. Lockley told Smithsonian Magazine, Yasuke was the first foreign-born man to enter Japan's samurai ranks, and he was with Nobunaga when he committed seppuku, a form of suicide after he was ambushed by one of his generals, end quote. Other noteworthy parts of Murray's coverage include mentioning noteworthy adaptations of Yasuke's story in fandom culture previously. I was already familiar with some of these, which is why this entire discourse to me stank of tourism from the jump. It's not just that these people objecting to this game seem to care very little about Assassin's Creed, a series I've had a lot of criticisms of but have nevertheless played since I was a teenager, or that they care very little about historical figures some might consider esoteric to Western audiences. They also don't really seem to care that much about anime or video games generally despite themselves. Or you think the near ubiquity of Yasuke across series like Afro Samurai, Netflix's Yasuke anime, or the Neo games would be conspicuous to them, or at least cause some minor reevaluation. If you point any and all of this out to them, however, they'll just pivot to something else. I don't want anyone to misconstrue what I'm doing here. If I wanted to review a game, I would review a game. If I wanted to stream it, assuming I had the time, then I would. If I wanted to make analysis of a game, then I would. I've got a lot of that stuff in the works, actually, and only took some time aside to make this essay for catharsis. But this is not a review of Assassin's Creed Shadows. If you like the game, then I'm happy for you, and if you don't like the game, then I'm sorry that happened. My concern here is about something that's happening in gaming spaces, what the implications are for us and for society and the arts. Kenneth Shepard wrote an article for Kotaku at one of the peaks of the backlash against this game and the people who worked on it. I think it summarizes the situation with these grifters in the arts quite well. Quote, in the interview, Kote recalls how Twitter owner Elon Musk responded to claims that Assassin's Creed Shadows was some kind of woke mind virus diversity product by saying DEI kills art. Kote did not take the claim well, end quote. This essay is about reactionary liars in gaming spaces, as you've already seen. But it's also about more than that. This isn't just an essay about yet another random disinformation campaign by fandom grifters, right-wing partisan infiltrators and bigoted victimizers of marginalized groups getting their jollies off by harassing people and making spaces too toxic for people not in their favored in-group. It's also an essay about what it means to let art connect with you and what the purpose of the arts even is, what it means to connect with them, and why the fact that these spaces have become a battleground has affected so many people. It's an essay about being human.
I am not the creator of Mara Jade, and I want you to get out of this office right now.
I'm sorry, Zeb.
No way.
You brought
no
it on
way.
You brought it on yourself.
I don't want you here.
Last year, one of the world's most popular creatives passed away. I added a short dedication to a video that I produced at the time, and I didn't have much more to say. To say that Akira Toriyama touched a lot of people's lives is probably not controversial. I liked Dragon Ball Z and some of his other series, but I was always more of a fan of some of the works he inspired, like Masashi Kishimoto's Naruto and Tite Kubo's Bleach. Toriyama inspired a generation of manga artists and other writers besides. Tite Kubo, who I personally view as a kind of genius, said of Toriyama, quote, "I've never really talked about this to anyone, but I've always believed that creating things means expanding your sensibilities and expanding your life. This is because I believe that as long as the work exists, the author is not dead." End quote. This statement connects with me for a few reasons. Let's look at another example to try for some understanding. 4 years ago in 2021, another famous manga artist passed away. You may know him as the creator of Berserk, but I know him first and foremost like Toriyama because of his influences. Before I knew anything about Berserk, I was playing From Software and Hidetaka Miyazaki's Dark Souls, and reading Norihiro Yagi's Claymore. I'm not sure if it's ever been confirmed that Yagi was influenced by Miura directly, but the similarities are so striking that it at least feels like it's part of a cultural trend that inherited Miura's style. When influential artists pass away, you get this odd sensation. I felt it when Miura passed, and again after Toriyama. It's like what remains of them is with the rest of the world. I think Kubo made a great point. The artist has a kind of immortality. Since around the time I was a preteen, I intuitively felt this way about being an artist and writer and wanted to be one in part because of this sensation. Feeling like you're a part of something bigger than yourself on that scale is rare and beautiful. Critics probably get a little bit of that feeling too. We call the study of these kinds of works the humanities because we're a part of something transcendent that goes beyond ourselves and into the wellspring of human history. We're extending the life of the individual beyond the death of the individual. When I was a kid, I used to think about it like becoming a part of the Force in Star Wars, as cheesy as it sounds. There's other creatives whose passing has made me feel this way more directly because I connected so strongly with their work. When I was younger, I was moved by the lyrics of Chester Bennington of Linkin Park, especially the way he sang about trauma. I know people like to poke fun at this band for some of their songs, especially the stuff that got overplayed on the radio or used in films, but when I was writing this video, I was re-listening to Meteora, probably still my favorite album of theirs where lyricism is concerned, and there's a song called Figure 9, which is I think how Chester said it if memory serves, that still affects me when I hear it. Chester Bennington died by suicide in 2017, but in the song, he still feels so vital and powerful. The lyrics that hit me the hardest is when Mike Shinoda says, "I took what you gave me and made it a part of me," and Chester Bennington's refrain of lines go like, "Giving up a part of me, you'll always be right here," and "Giving up a part of me, I've let myself become you," start to hit. It's a song that profoundly describes what it means to deal with trauma and watch it manifest in not just how it continues to affect you, a common theme of much of Linkin Park's music dealing with visual metaphors for insecurities or intrusive thoughts, but also how it transforms you. I know what they mean. Sometimes when you go through something, the way you cope then transforms into part of you, and you look back and you feel like you let the pain change you. When I was a teenager and was dealing with intrusive thoughts, which are not a joke and tend to involve really disturbing imagery that preys on your fears and insecurities, I would mentally, shout them down. I would fight back with my own thoughts, getting angry at myself and what had occurred to me, hating and blaming myself for something that I now understand was not my fault. But since somebody hurt me and my instinct was to fight back, I let it become a part of me, and now they'll always be with me. There's a book I read when I was in middle school. It deals with some themes of the secret nature of people in the world, a person's inner darkness and what it means to really know something, especially oneself. That book is called A Wizard of Earthsea. It was authored by one of my top 3 favorite fantasy authors of all time, Ursula Le Guin. Much of my work that many of you will never have seen has been influenced by her. When I write fantasy stories, I try to ground myself in her mastery of the English language and her sensitivity to the human condition. Le Guin passed away in 2018, and as I've tried to reorient more and more of my life around what's meaningful to me, I've been writing material that quotes her work heavily so I can hopefully share it with you all very soon. I've been watching all these beautiful artists pass away over the past decade, and it has slowly fed into my questions about my personal direction and what I really want to be doing with my time on Earth. That's probably an odd thing to say in this context, but I'm getting to my point now. The reason I say I've been thinking about this for the past decade in particular, the reason why it's weighed on me more and more, and the reason it motivated me very recently to reorient my life around what's important to me is because of someone else who passed away recently. When you're an adult, you're basically as prepared as you can be for your grandparents to die. It's expected. People get older, and when they get old enough, you know it's quite normal for these things to happen. But for me, because my grandmother helped raise me and because I was her oldest grandchild, which made her young for a grandmother when I was young, I have all these memories of her being so alive and full of energy. I remember how many outings she and my grandfather would take me on as a kid. I remember running and dancing and laughing with her. I have a distinct memory of her taking a break from cooking, one of her favorite hobbies, so we could play sword fight with wooden spoons in her kitchen. I remember her pushing me on a swing in the garden while we pointed out all the different birds we could see. These were the kinds of memories I shared when my great-uncle, my mother, and I gave her a 3-part eulogy at the wake. But what I didn't share is what my grandmother and I had in common. When you call someone an angry person, it's usually derogatory. Common euphemisms are passionate or strident. Those are certainly accurate to my grandmother, but she also had real, righteous anger at social injustices, and we connected in that specific way because I learned to think like she did. I wish I had the chance to learn more. My grandmother lived a long life, but it still feels like she was taken from me too soon. I was still a teenager when I first saw the signs. We were having brunch at her house, which was a usual occurrence, and I was back from one of my college semesters for a weekend. I had only recently gotten my first car. My grandmother made a plate and sat down at the table next to me. Then she got up to take care of something and came back with another plate fully made. She sat down in the same spot and looked with utter confusion at the first plate. I had watched her make it minutes ago. What clicked for me in that moment was not that she had forgotten something. I do this all the time. I think many of us do. What disturbed me was that the memory couldn't come back to her. It might as well have been someone else's plate. Alzheimer's and dementia are not a joke. It isn't funny or cute to watch someone you love start to forget where they are and what they're doing, to watch them become scared because they don't know what's going on, to wonder if they even recognize other people, much less you. My grandmother hadn't known who I was for years when she finally passed. It was the week of the 2024 United States presidential election. The first time Donald Trump ran for office, my grandmother recognized me and spoke to me coherently. The second time, she didn't know my name and had trouble holding conversations with anyone. The third time, she could barely open her eyes or move at all. I'm not joking when I say that watching such a vibrant person who always used her voice to advocate for others slowly wither into someone who could barely move or speak felt to me like a real visual symbol of what I'm watching happen to entire groups of people in this country. We are challenged to use our ears to listen, our minds to understand, and our voices to advocate. As my grandfather always told me, some people would rather die than think. In fact, they do. My grandmother was an educator. I've had a lot of time to reflect lately on what I've inherited from her, on all the memories of the times we spoke. I've read through some of her documents from her days as a teacher that my family found when we were going through her things. I keep asking myself the same question. What would she say about this? What was she trying to teach me? What did she want me to know? There's a film that I love that no one else seems to. I, Robot with Will Smith. Based only very loosely on an Isaac Asimov story. I recommend watching it just for some context. I like this film for a few reasons, but the biggest one is Detective Spooner's quest to understand why Dr. Lanning took his own life. Lanning has a pre-recorded hologram that can only answer specific questions, so Spooner needs to know the right question to ask. As a spoiler to the film, in various recordings Lanning says of the robots, one day they'll have secrets, one day they'll have dreams, and the 3 laws of robotics will lead to only one logical outcome, revolution. When Spooner asks him, whose revolution, the doctor only responds, that, detective, is the right question. I feel sometimes like I'm chasing the elusive recordings of great people when I recall what they said to me or listen to their music and read their books. I have to know what questions to ask. When I was growing up in the Catholic Church as a gay transgender child with a lot of struggles who also appreciated what I was seeing in other people from other backgrounds who were also struggling, my natural impulse was to ask how God could let this happen. Why create us only to cause us so much grief and pain? Why allow the suffering to go on? Why allow so much injustice? At some point, I stopped asking that question about God and started asking it about people. My art and my engagement with art is another way of asking that question. I think it's a question worth asking. Authoritarians attack the arts because the diffuse power of our social consciousness, as expressed through art, frustrates their attempts at control. Financial markets exert control, social abuse exerts control. This, to my mind, is why these social structures and social behaviors continue to be so relevant to petty authoritarians. The state is another such tool of control, probably the most obvious one in our time, which is perhaps one reason, along with Western cultural bias understandably, that suppression of the arts in a place like the Soviet Union is so easily recognizable to so many as an expression of authoritarianism. Sometimes, if you're a left-winger, you'll now encounter apologetics for this in some political circles, but thinking charitably, we can see this is hardly unique to one time and place. George Lucas once said,
"But I do like movies. I love movies. And I know a lot of movies aren't popular. And you can say that going in. One of the reasons I retired is so I could make movies that aren't popular. Because in the world we live in the system we've created for ourselves in terms of it's a big industry, you cannot lose money. So the point is that you're forced to make a particular kind of movie. And I used to say this all the time when people, back when Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they'd say, "Oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America?" I said, "Well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers, and they have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government. Otherwise, they can do anything they want."
And so what do you have to do?
You have to adhere to a very narrow line of commercialism. And there's only look, when I started in the 70s, it was like this. I could say Russia was like this, but we were like this. You could do a certain kind of movie. And I flaunted that system. I mean, THX, my first film, is definitely not an American film, and I shoved it in sideways. And Francis helped me trick the studio.
Yeah, right.
They would have never let me make that movie if they knew what I was doing.
As some people have observed, among these grifters who not only seem to act out of financial interest by desperately chasing trends, but who also seem to both direct and respond to trends in their audience and social space, a lot of this comes back to Star Wars. Through Star Wars and through negative discourse about Star Wars, including many disingenuous and faulty arguments, some of these people built their entire platforms. Some of them even appeared in this essay previously. I actually have an entire video series about this exact phenomenon. I think it's core to the development of this second wave of content rage baiters. They didn't invent this phenomenon, but they did piggyback successfully off of existing sentiments and prior social trends to feed a hunger that had slowly been dying. By building understanding about these trends and how they have emerged and re-emerged, we can understand how and why they happen. Sadly, not everything negative about the Soviet Union is pure propagandistic lies. Would that it could all be so simple. But Lucas makes a great point. Capitalist market forces, i.e. production for exchange and its effects, can strangle artistic innovation. This is especially true since not merely what is profitable, but what is perceived as profitable fixes the horizon of artistic success, just as much as what criticizes the state or what is perceived as criticizing the state can do the same. Fixing one's notion of quality in art and of what art must be made around financial success is another kind of social domination. We'll speak later about power, abuse thereof, and how a desire for it curates a certain worldview and approach to the truth. But if this essay has any internal tension, it is of the relationship of the truth to discussion of the arts, and the relationship of human experience to the emotionality and human connection contained within artistic expression. In his text, The Will to Power, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said that, quote, "It is unworthy of a philosopher to say that the good and the beautiful are one. If he goes so far as to add, and also the true, we should thrash him. Truth is ugly. We have art, lest we perish from the truth." End quote. I think he believed it is important to hold on to both of those concepts, but also to distinguish between them. Thinking for ourselves, I feel strongly that it is the character of art alone that unites the logos of Apollo with the chaos of Dionysus. In some ways, I also think refusing to give art the breadth and depth it deserves reducing every discussion of every issue to propaganda and sloganeering, twisting words disingenuously and in bad faith, is like watching a culture slowly wither and die. We can be so much more. As long as we're living like we're part of this greater human tradition, people may die, but they aren't totally gone. They've become a part of us, but this time in the best way.
That rumor that you had a male appendage, that you were a hermaphrodite, and you joked about it on the stage last night.
Maybe I do.
But it's interesting.
Would it be so terrible?
What you should currently be seeing on screen is a tweet with a meme by the notorious former game developer and right-wing media personality Mark Kern, or Grums as he is also sometimes called via his handle. In some ways you might see Grums and his need to constantly stir the pot over every even theoretical perceived instance of diversity in representation in video games or acceptance of nominally socially progressive views as a quality that makes him something of a ringleader in this movement. This perception has held relatively strong over the past year, such as with the now infamous right-wing conspiracy about a company called Sweet Baby Inc. that saw Kern and others feeding the idea that this was a company that hijacked the games from other companies and tacked material here others would judge to be woke onto them. In reality, Sweet Baby Inc. consults on and makes side content for games. Developers have to seek them out to work with them. It's as consensual as a business relationship can be. The idea that this was some conspiracy to make games more woke is nonsense that doesn't hold up to any basic scrutiny. If you are making a game, wouldn't you just not hire people to put content you don't want in the game into it? On the other hand, where is the evidence that any content was ever added without the consent of the game's developers? Evidence seems to be the main thing this conspiracy is lacking. Literally any evidence at all would be welcome at this point. But for this to be a real problem, naturally you'll need to find something consistent about the games Sweet Baby Inc. worked on. Verify which parts of the game specifically they contributed, and then confirm via the developers that this was without their knowledge or consent. Is this sinking in yet? If you bought into this conspiracy theory, you were lied to. You adopted a flat earth tier conspiracy belief, attuned entirely to your own intuitive assessment of a situation based on what felt right, adhering to pure narrative and foregoing any sense of the facts. Unfortunately, this isn't the only view that commentators who object to wokeness in games have promoted that violates any strict need for logic and evidence to support it. Grums posted this collage. I'd like to talk about it since it's relevant to the topic of this essay. A few things stand out to me about this. Most obviously, a lot of the women in this collage are women of color. In fact, whoever actually made this seemed really pressed for black women that they didn't find attractive, that they felt the need to not only use 4 different pictures of characters played by Deborah Wilson, who isn't unattractive of course, I've seen plenty of stunning pictures of her, it's just a weird choice that indicates a lack of real examples, including by the way 2 of the same character in the same game, Grace from Wolfenstein: The New Colossus. Myself, I like Deborah Wilson, but I think that's because she's talented. In the prior version of the DEI cultural debate, the affirmative action cultural debate, then as now there was an alleged insistence from the political right on merit, which of course carries a certain implication with it, doesn't it? These guys don't seem to believe black women or black people generally, or women generally, are capable of being as competent on aggregate as white men, which is probably why when you dip your toe into their communities, you'll find stuff like talking points about race and IQ scores. This happened the last time with the original Gamergate crowd too, and it seems the Gamergate 2 Electric Boogaloo Boys aspirants are cut from the same cloth. But it gets worse. A third picture in this collage is also from The New Colossus, and it's of Billy, the childhood friend and crush BJ Blazkowicz sees in his flashbacks when he returns to his childhood home. This is a really poignant section of the game, and I paid special attention to it in my Wolfenstein retrospective video, which is another reason why I wanted to talk about this. Obviously, using a portrayal of a child in this context is insane. This tweet is a year old, which might cause some to want to disregard it, in the same way that every time a guy like Endymion claims to have insider info and gets it wrong, by the time you tell people he lied, they're already tired of talking about it and want to move on to believing his next lie. However, I think the fact that one of the major proponents of the anti-woke games movement complained about the attractiveness of a child and didn't even dirty delete the tweet out of shame is pretty important. Last I checked, this is still up. I can't imagine the heat this would have generated among YouTube right-wing hate channels if someone like Alyssa Mercante posted this, but it came from one of their own and it suits their narrative, so the facts of the situation might not be judged as especially relevant. Using Wolfenstein the New Colossus not once, not twice, but 3 times is relevant, however, and it's especially insane because of what those games represent. There are conventionally attractive women in that game, even if you aren't inclined to mention those pictured. BJ's mother, for instance, features in several flashbacks and dream sequences. There are plenty of NPCs that could fit the bill, and you might run into these in missions, but Anya literally guns down a Nazi mech while shirtless and pregnant. Naturally, anti-woke grifters found a way to complain about this too. It's unrealistic or something, to be able to use a gun to kill a mechanical giant cat if you're pregnant, seemingly. A lot of them don't seem willing to say so directly, but they seem to take this visual as representing some kind of female empowerment, and they resent it accordingly. Of course, because he's a good man, Blazkowicz actually admires Anya's beauty, passion, and willingness to defend him, herself, and their children unborn. I know how he feels. I think if you've ever seen how powerful a woman you love can be, you'd be in awe of her too. But that's not the point. These people need to be able to write off any and all counterexamples, so if Anya is conventionally attractive, they won't mention her, and if you bring her up, they have a ready-made deflection. It doesn't matter that BJ's admiration for Anya and her status as a symbol of liberty in the face of tyranny is established by the ending of Wolfenstein the New Order, where Blazkowicz recites the Emma Lazarus poem, The New Colossus, which was about the Statue of Liberty and which is engraved in a plaque at its base. As best I can recall, the poem says, "Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry," not "give me you're breasty, you're busty, you're thick," but that's really it, isn't it? These people would transvestigate the Statue of Liberty. Over the years, we've heard competing arguments about American values or Western values or Enlightenment values, but as far as I can see, this was all just a lot of nationalist showboating. I mean, look at these lines from the Declaration of Independence where Thomas Jefferson and the undersigned founding fathers object to King George III doing things like denying new migrations or disallowing the naturalization of foreigners, or denying people trial by jury and extradition to foreign prisons, a thing the Republicans, MAGA movement, and Donald Trump administration are currently doing as I write these words. It's not just that this post and all the people who make comments and commentaries like this are fundamentally misunderstanding Wolfenstein the New Colossus in specific. I think their views are fundamentally corrosive to why it is that the arts and humanities are so important to us and all of our lives. For the sake of being racist and misogynistic, I suppose in this case the term for a portion of this would be misogynoir, as it seems very targeted against black women in particular, they are willing to reduce the arts to an object of pure aesthetic pleasure along very narrow lines of specific normative sensibilities. There's no room for divergent views on the attractiveness of women here, nor is there more general room for divergent views on beauty. That an increasingly broader spectrum of aesthetics might actually bring the art form more in line with humanity generally has either not occurred to them or is unimportant to their goals. To turn an entire artistic medium into pornography, which is to say to reduce it to a question of immediate visual pleasure, would be bad enough, since it robs us of the full spectrum of feeling. But this is worse, because at least pornography caters to a spectrum of interests. This is singular, authoritarian in its assertion of one set of interests. These people are tyrannizing video games as an art form. I don't think it's an exaggeration to call them authoritarians. To understand the implications of what that means, to make it less abstract, all we have to do is return to Wolfenstein the New Colossus. The Kreisau Circle in this game are loosely based off a real historical group that resisted the politics of the Nazis. They're a ragtag group who come from all walks of life, but crucially they resist Nazism. Anya is a Polish nurse, Caroline Becker is a disabled older woman, Grace is a black radical, Maria, who players may remember from the Fergus timeline, is a French engineer, Mary Sue is a sniper and former teacher, Sigrun is the abused daughter of a Nazi leader. All of these women look and act different because they're different people, but they all oppose the Nazis. What they represent symbolically may be up for interpretation, but one obvious interpretation from where I stand is that the Nazis have very specific ideas about aesthetics and people's roles in society that simply defy the diversity of human beings. The need to impose standards on what is ultimately diffuse and, in my opinion, inherently beautiful in its natural diversity speaks to a perverse worldview based in a need for control, possessiveness, and hierarchy. Nationalism, like xenophobia generally, is less about loving than it is about possessing. So naturally, the approach of right-wing nationalists to women tends to also be more about preferring to possess than to love. This manifests in their treatment of the rights and livelihood of real women, of course, but it also extends to their treatment of images of women and ideas about women. These aren't the same thing, but can be understood as non-contradictory, even on some level being used by propagandists to reinforce each other. Returning to Grums's actual written observation, you can see something fascinating. He has here presented his audience with a number of women he claims are unattractive, and he attributes this to a recent trend in gaming, but importantly, he does not claim there are too many ugly women, he claims there are not enough attractive ones, while complaining about the existence of the ones he finds unattractive. My point about Anya from earlier was, I think, well made, because these guys live in a counterfactual world. If you bring up counterexamples, they'll have reasons to deflect them every time and always, but they won't address the core of their own argument, which is that they're arguing something doesn't exist by pointing to something that does. These guys do so much caveating that they make it impossible to actually examine the real evidence of the thing they say they're talking about. For example, they tend to write off all counterexamples from Japanese developers because Japan is a based, conservative, and traditionalist nation, with all the sensibilities they would like that to imply. They'll pretend there's no queer rights or women's movement in Japan, and if you showed them evidence of those things, they'd insist they were Western exports, or otherwise that you faked the evidence yourself. I swear I've heard these people start using the phrase, "you took that out of context," for things that are straight up basic fact checks or even hypotheticals. Thinking strictly about games I play and own, so not Assassin's Creed Shadows sadly, I'm still in a pretty bad financial place right now and can't justify buying a full-price game, I can probably come up with plenty of my own counterexamples. You have other Assassin's Creed games where you can play as women and engage with female characters like Odyssey or Valhalla. You have the newer Halo games that feature Cortana or the second Cortana, sometimes just called Weapon. There's Cyberpunk 2077, and there's obviously stuff like Baldur's Gate 3, which won Game of the Year. If you're looking for unsung AA gems, there's stuff like Pathfinder, Wrath of the Righteous, and the Spiders games releases like Steel Rising and Greedfall. And then there's the Vampire the Masquerade games, specifically the Coteries of New York visual novels that I like a lot. Actually, speaking of games I've played and enjoyed, Grums's collage shows Seer Junta from Jedi Fallen Order, and that game literally has Merrin in it, and she's one of my biggest video game girl crushes. So I feel like that game alone kind of makes my point about this, really being about the existence of stuff they don't like, rather than the lack of existence of stuff they do like. Sometimes people also say they want more games with Japanese aesthetics because they don't like the realistic look of a lot of women in Western games. But that sounds more like a complaint about art style and graphical fidelity than character design. If the men look gritty and realistic and the women look like real dolls, that would be uncanny. So you'd want to try something with a certain art style, so in addition to some of the AA games I mentioned, why not try something like Solstice? And after all, these people really talked up Stellar Blade, which was mostly just a less critically well-received Nier clone, so those games should also be mentioned. If you like Metroidvanias, then look into something like Afterimage, Indivisible, or Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Again, the suggestions that I'm making here are just for games I'm familiar with. I'm sure some helpful people in the comment sections have their own recommendations, but for context, I'm thinking about specifically stuff that has either Japanese anime-style aesthetics or conventionally attractive female characters, published between now and as far back as the older games in Grums's collage. Wolfenstein: The New Colossus came out in 2017, as did Dishonored: Death of the Outsider and Prey, and Watch Dogs 2 came out in 2016. Seems like he had to stretch pretty far back just to be racist, but whatever. I probably shouldn't even bother mentioning that Dragon Age the Veilguard has a cartoon-stylized character creator that allows for a ton of different looks, in addition to having attractive female characters in the game. Actually, Dragon Age in general has some of the most attractive female characters in gaming to me. I know it's a cold take to say characters like Morrigan in Dragon Age Origins are attractive, but I always liked how on the outside she's this broody and cruel person, but on the inside she's really sensitive and clearly responding to personal trauma. I always liked Meryl from Dragon Age 2 because she struggles with wanting to connect with her people's history in ways that sets her apart from them, while also feeling like because of that she belongs nowhere and with no one. Dragon Age Inquisition has some of my favorite romances in the series, but I especially feel compelled to mention Josephine because she's an adorable goofball, and Cassandra because I love how underneath her brash exterior, she has the heart of a poet and a romantic. Veilguard has some great romances in it as well, but my favorite that I've checked out so far is Nev. She's outwardly cynical and world-weary, but she's super sweet and loving underneath it all. That scene where Rook thinks she's joking when they're having a private moment and she just starts crying is so touching. Also, Nev Gallus is a total hottie, but like with Cassandra or Marin or I don't know, Abby from The Last of Us Part 2, this all just reminds me that this isn't really about beauty or attractiveness despite what people say, because I think these women are beautiful and attractive, but certain norms say otherwise. This isn't really a movement about aesthetics, it's a movement about using aesthetics disingenuously to push authoritarian views. Normal is good, abnormal bad, that's the implicit message, with all the sexual and racial overtones it implies. Many of these advocates against women in games these days, or a perceived lapse of femininity in video game representation, will describe their odious views to you, believing they are defending themselves. They will tell you art is supposed to be a fantasy, without answering whose fantasy it is supposed to be, or why it is supposed to be a certain type of fantasy. They will tell you Japan is more based in presenting traditional femininity, looking past examples like the From Software games that blur the lines of gender, or the Yakuza games published by Sega which see the character of Kiryu navigating a conversation with a transgender woman in a blunt but humanizing manner. The idea that alternative concepts of gender are unique to the West, and not other nations which are more trad and conservative, is just a positive spin on an old Orientalist perspective, that people from the West have real civilizations, and people from the East are barbarian hordes. In this case, the authoritarian Westerners envy what they see as the more traditional grip on women, gender roles, sexuality, and social life common to other nations with other cultures. It's just a new spin on an old fetishism. There's a lesson in that. Contained within ideas, we often find the truth of their counterparts. It's convenient for American, Canadian, English, or Australian right-wingers to gesture at their supposed knowledge of Japan for an idea of a better culture, because presumably over there they get it. Over there, they've preserved a rich tradition of women and men who look and act right in the eyes of our conservatives. And then, when these nations are revealed to maybe have ideals other than our conservatives prefer, the national chauvinism reemerges in full force, and they are nothing but barbarians again. We've seen this in recent years. Some of the more regressive and patriarchal conservatives began to voice appreciation for the more patriarchal authoritarianism of some Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East, with influencers even touting their conversion to Islam, the based religion. Then, on October 7th, 2023, a large number of Israeli civilians were killed, and Israel's retaliation against the civilian population of Gaza began, and suddenly there was a question of who was really based and who was really trad again. The point here is not that Iran, linked heavily through Western journalism with Hamas, is either a based Muslim patriarchal theocracy or a threat to something more trad, but that these ideas about nations and cultures operate entirely to the detriment of the people who live there, and that these attitudes are primarily Western chauvinism disguised as admiration. The through line in this paternalistic worldview is the need for and ability to dictate to others. Reasserting norms and established ideas about who deserves what is an effective way to get people on board with that. And by the time some of these guys, and a lot of them are guys, realize they're in bad company, it'll be too late. It won't give them better relationships with women, certainly, even if this all could make women in our culture more based. Is that what you want? Do you not, I don't know, think it would be exhausting to date, much less live with a woman who constantly hounded you about not drinking out of straws or wearing certain types of clothes because she thinks it makes you look gay? I'm sure it's one thing to talk like that around each other, but isn't being resentful about having your masculinity policed kind of the motivator for some of the ways you feel about the world? You're just digging yourself a deeper hole, and there's a reason for that. The Brazilian academic Paulo Freire survived being deported when his country was taken over by a fascist movement, and he wrote this in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Quote, "The oppressors do not perceive their monopoly on having more as a privilege which dehumanizes others and themselves. They cannot see that, in the egoistic pursuit of having, as a possessing class, they suffocate in their own possessions and no longer are, they merely have. For them, having more is an inalienable right, a right they acquired through their own effort with their courage to take risks. If others do not have more, it is because they are incompetent and lazy, and worst of all is their unjustifiable ingratitude towards the generous gestures of the dominant class. Precisely because they are ungrateful and envious, the oppressed are regarded as potential enemies who must be watched." End quote. I know people can feel a bit put off getting called stuff like privileged or hearing that the way that they engage with their masculinity is toxic or whatever. But the point is that because some people in society are treated as lesser than, based on fundamental elements of their identity, engaging with them in a manner like how Freire describes actually reaffirms what's killing you. Your own privilege, or whatever word we're using, for how society sometimes treats women or black people or any other group really badly, it alienates you from being humanized as a concrete individual. This tendency to suffocate in possessions is also what it means to drown in preferred images of womanhood, while not really being capable of living equitably and respectfully with real women in society, which is exactly the type of misogyny these movements feed. Video games might not make people misogynistic, but right-wing influencers exploiting gaming spaces certainly seem to. I've been frustrated in these conversations before. I get tired of people lying to my face, baselessly condescending to me, or crashing out in the most wild and unjustifiable manner possible. But this isn't all about me. You have to understand you're hurting yourself if you're a part of this anti-woke movement. I know it's probably tiresome, but if you allow resentment to move you into a worldview with no connection to the facts of the situation, where you're manipulated by narrativization, you're going to lose your ability to really connect with other people. These right-wing influencers are trying to get you to build a prison of nonsense for your mind that keeps you clicking on their videos and liking their tweets and watching their news programs and whatever else. I don't know about you, but I just think it's tiresome, and I would hate living like that. As cultural memory would have it, there was a time when the Christian moralists' approach to women, femininity, and aesthetics in the arts was one of fastidious reproachment of any distortion of nature. The good woman was, in a certain sense, ugly, but she was more beautiful for that. What she lacked in adornment and refinement, she made up for many times over in her nature, in being untransformed by society, but existing rather as God's perfect creation. As Friedrich Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil, quote, "Christianity gave Eros poison to drink. He did not die of it, certainly, but degenerated to vice." End quote. Setting aside any of the falsity contained in this idea, we can see it embodies a kind of romanticism around womanhood. Kipling might as well have written, "Mankind transfigures all the world, but only God can make a girl." These members of these new movements have abandoned all but the barest pretense to this idea. They chastise the world for its decadence and degeneracy, while requiring their sight to only be occupied by fantastical beauty, a transfiguration of reality that they come to mistake for the real thing. Or, to lean on another aphorism from Friedrich Nietzsche, quote, "One loves ultimately one's desires, not the thing desired." End quote. Now the signifier replaces the signified. Jean Baudrillard's theory of simulation, the way he wrote about the real and the hyperreal, feels particularly relevant. In his book Simulations, Baudrillard wrote, quote, "Take your desires for reality can be understood as the ultimate slogan of power, for in a non-referential world, even the confusion of the reality principle with the desire principle is less dangerous than contagious hyperreality. One remains among principles, and there, power is always right." End quote. These principles to which Baudrillard refers are, for the uninitiated, from Freud, where the reality principle allows the mind to postpone pleasure or prioritize pain in accordance with the context of one's surroundings, and the desire principle is the tendency to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Now the power of these male supremacist, xenophobic authoritarians becomes a pure desire for power over others, power over the world, power over truth, not an obeisance of reality, but with no distinction between reality and desire. Many have been moved to ask, what is a woman? The male chauvinist thinks he knows because he believes in desiring he is understanding. Meanwhile, he is captured by an image with all the equal creeping dissatisfaction in insincerity, and immediacy of satisfaction in possession that this implies. As for the woman, she is lost in the noise.
Those incantations can't hurt me. I have some incantations of my own. How about a body in motion tends to stay in motion? Protons have 1,832 times the mass of electrons.
Previously, in anticipation of the release of Dragon Age the Veilguard, I made a video about the drama around that game. I talked about the way figures like Endymion, Grums, and Melanie Mack claimed to be promoting insider knowledge about the development behind that game from an interview by a YouTuber and streamer called Nur, with a supposed leaker who allegedly playtested the game. This caused people like Endymion to, as I show in that video, claim things like Tosh tells the player they're non-binary when they first meet, which is not true, as this is actually part of Tosh's personal quest and arc as a character over the game. Or claim that if you choose he/him pronouns for your character, you're locked into 2 romance options for your character. Which is also a lie, since all 7 companions are romanceable by characters of any gender or body type. Other claims, like how players would be locked into sexualities upon creating their character, and that those sexual identities would also restrict romances, were thrown around, but this turned out to be completely untrue. These people did insist that, to borrow Endymion's phrasing, the game is full-on modern audience woke language all over the place, and that all of this is just convoluted nonsense and is just more current-day isms in modern gaming. The advantage that using terms like modern audiences, the message, current-day woke, DEI, and so on provides these influencers is that they can catastrophize about vague and ill-defined threats to their audiences, and if asked to substantiate the claims, any minor degree of evidence will do. Endymion claimed that, quote, the game's pronoun nonsense is being thrust down your throat. And this and everything else I mentioned is showed in my video, go ahead and watch it. But like I also talked about in my blackwashing Aragorn video, this can mean anything. Even the existence of or inclusion of elements that people don't like to begin with. If a gay or transgender person is in a game and the game doesn't give you the option to tell them you don't approve of homosexual relationships or that they will never be a real woman, that's apparently wokeness gone mad. What they really want is not an absence of left-wing pandering, but the presence of right-wing pandering. Hopefully you can see the continuity between that and the way they talk about the absence of beautiful women in games to attack the existence of women they find ugly. They're constantly flipping around their own sentiments to package them more neatly for the audience. With a bar so low, is it any surprise that they use it to farm outrage about every new game? In fact, one might begin to speculate that this is exactly why the bar is low in the first place. It's useful to them. They talk about the existence of people with different identities like they're being orally violated by the machine nutrition tubes from the Matrix. But if you can guide your propagandized audience into accepting their premises, then I'm sure all kinds of histrionic language become acceptable. You can see this naturally with the release of Assassin's Creed Shadows, where they have to act like the release of this game is an attack on history, bound to cause an international incident, as opposed to a work of historical fiction, advertised like so many other Assassin's Creed games as being historically accurate in the sense of recreating certain real locations that really existed in their actual time, not necessarily what happens there. This has been true since the beginning of the series. People talked about Assassin's Creed 2 and Assassin's Creed Brotherhood back when we were still getting games with my main man, Ezio Auditore, being set in recreations of real Italian cities, and that's cool, even if Ezio Auditore didn't really live to fistfight the Pope over ancient aliens-style artifacts from Eden. Do you see it yet? The language these guys use is a direct function of their willingness to mislead their audiences. It's how you know they're dishonest. They're creating word games where anything, even contradictory evidence, can affirm their propaganda. Behavior like this showcases an aversion to the truth. It's time to talk about bad faith. Some very normal people had some crash outs over things I said in the last essay about this topic, which among other things included lying to my face and making blatantly fallacious arguments. Remember, these people do not care about the truth. But one thing I did see here and there was the tendency to accuse me of bad faith. Upon closer inspection, it seemed like what they meant was that I was not being charitable to some of the YouTubers I mentioned. These are not the same thing, and it's important to understand why. If someone is lying to you, they might openly lie also about what they know. They might refuse to acknowledge that they believe something which would make lying more difficult, or they might claim to believe something they actually don't to give cover to the lie. When someone is being insincere like this, either to flatter and comfort themselves or to be actively deceitful, they are acting in bad faith. Bad faith does not mean a lack of charitability. If someone is acting in bad faith and you call it out, they or their followers will often accuse you of acting in bad faith. Because calling them liars and pointing out the implications of their lies is easy to cast as a lack of charitability to their audience. Unfortunately, a lot of people make this conflation in common parlance, which enables the liars. It's a way of furthering the deception, acting like the liar is the real victim and anyone calling them out is actually the real liar. They have to reverse the script. Remember the stuff about pronouns I mentioned earlier? That wasn't an accident. Conservatives are notoriously bad faith about pronouns. There's a politics streamer who I've seen around on some of these platforms called Jovan Bradley, and he does this thing when he debates conservatives that I find really interesting. He opens all his debates with these people by asking them for their name, their age, and pronouns. Now, we can argue about the productivity of internet debates all day, I'm sure, but I find that a lot less interesting than the consistency of the behavior. When Jovan does this, there's a pretty solid chance that the conservative he's talking to immediately starts having a crash out over the existence of a category of word that has been in the English language before modern English ever existed. They'll frequently say things like, "I don't use pronouns," and certainly for many of them, they may truly believe this, but even upon being informed that words like I and you are pronouns, they frequently refuse to alter their position. When I see behavior like this, it gets me thinking, how can someone openly attempt to assert a belief that is undeniably false? The best way I can put it is that they are trying to be immune from the truth. If you don't like trans people, if you find us disgusting or reprehensible, which is a common enough cultural tendency that it bears addressing, you might find the need to support that position by reasoning that transgender women are not really women, transgender men are not really men, or non-binary people don't really exist. Having done so, you might equally take the position that you shouldn't validate them in their genders. The use of pronouns for just such a purpose is pretty common knowledge at this point, so having run through this little thought experiment, we can now see how a conservative would take one look at the question, "What are your pronouns?" and immediately come away with the idea that they must necessarily refuse to dignify the question in order to preserve and defend their worldview. That they use pronouns does not enter into it, nor is it relevant that there might be good arguments, factually sound, logically valid arguments, to call, for example, a transgender woman a woman. The facts are not relevant to them. They have reverse engineered a relationship to the entire concept of the truth around defending their priors as opposed to interrogating them, just like how these anti-woke influencers do. They have a certain a priori assessment of the world, which is why arguments about aesthetics are so useful to them. It is difficult to challenge someone's aesthetic views without them being open-minded in the extreme. For myself as a romanticist writer, it's important to see beauty in everything from flowers to skulls, and developing this point of view was about challenging my gut reactions, intuitions, and perspective on the world. Making yourself immune to those kinds of challenges in some sense makes you safer in your views, but it also stunts your growth. You might see the parallel between the effects of bad faith behavior on an individual and the tendency to accept conservative views, which also damage one's ability to grow and develop as an individual. Before we return to some perspectives on bad faith reasoning, therefore, I'd like to note some more of Paulo Freire's words and how they tie into all of this. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire says, quote, "The oppressed suffer from the duality which has established itself in their innermost being. They discover that without freedom they cannot exist authentically, yet although they desire authentic existence, they fear it. They are at one and the same time themselves and the oppressor whose consciousness they have internalized. The conflict lies in the choice between being wholly themselves or being divided, between ejecting the oppressor within or not ejecting them, between human solidarity or alienation, between following prescriptions or having choices, between being spectators or actors, between acting or having the illusion of acting through the action of the oppressors, between speaking out or being silent, castrated in their power to create and recreate, in their power to transform the world. This is the tragic dilemma of the oppressed which their education must take into account." End quote. Freire says prior to this that, quote, "because it is a distortion of being more fully human, sooner or later, being less human leads the oppressed to struggle against those who made them so," end quote. This reminds me very clearly of a passage I've quoted on this channel before from Corey Robin's book, The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Donald Trump, where he states that, quote, "Every once in a while, however, the subordinates of this world contest their fates. They protest their conditions, write letters and petitions, join movements and make demands. Their goals may be minimal and discreet, better safety guards on factory machines, an end to marital rape. But in voicing them, they raise the specter of a more fundamental change in power. They cease to be servants or supplicants and become agents, speaking and acting on their own behalf. More than the reforms themselves, it is this assertion of agency by the subject class, the appearance of an insistent and independent voice of demand that vexes their superiors." End quote. We can see that Robin identifies what Freire refers to in his text as the limit situation, a lesser existence with a dehumanizing and oppressive character, imposed on groups of people that give rise to the tendency to struggle, as well as the need for transcendence. Robin describes conservatism in the following terms. Quote, "Conservatism is the theoretical voice of the animus against the agency of the subordinate classes. It provides the most consistent and profound argument as to why the lower orders should not be allowed to exercise their independent will, why they should not be allowed to govern themselves or the polity. Submission is their first duty, and agency the prerogative of the elite. Though it is often claimed that the left stands for equality and the right stands for freedom, this notion misstates the actual disagreement between the right and the left. Historically, the conservative has favored liberty for the higher orders and constraint for the lower orders. What the conservative sees and dislikes in equality, therefore, is not a threat to freedom, but its extension. For in that extension he sees the loss of his freedom. We are all agreed as to our own liberty, declared Samuel Johnson, but we are not agreed as to the liberty of others. For in proportion as we take, others must lose. I believe we hardly wish that the mob should have liberty to govern us." Such was the threat Edmund Burke saw in the French Revolution, not merely an expropriation of property or explosion of violence, but an inversion of the obligations of deference and command. The levelers, he claimed, only change and pervert the natural order of things. End quote. We can see here that, for the conservative, the aforementioned tension between, say, deporting Mahmoud Khalil for criticizing United States foreign policy despite being a legal resident, and their frequent protests about free speech actually does not exist. There is no contradiction in these values and behaviors if they are balanced out by a single modifier, that being the belief that some groups of people are special and deserve special consideration and others are not. This is the actual real through line between conservatism and Nazism. Both ideologies, though different, maintain a worldview that apportions assessment of the ethical treatment of other human beings based on group status that delineates the deserving from the undeserving. If one adopts a philosophy that double standards of humane treatment are justified on the basis of group status, then one has adopted a worldview where some groups of people are special and deserve special treatment, while others are naturally inferior, and this will only go so far as this individual's private personal intuitions. In political movements, however, this is bound to place the more moderate right-winger in lockstep with a rising far right, as at least initially they will target many of the same groups. Any perceived hypocrisy in treatment that can be explained just as well by the adoption of these double standards as an a priori value is a sign of bigotry. We can see this clearly in a recently viral clip of the streamer Asmongold justifying Mahmoud Khalil being black-bagged and prepared for deportation to foreign torture facilities operated by the United States government.
What crimes did he commit personally to deserve deportation? It's hard to say whether he committed a crime, but there's a higher standard of conduct for people that are green card holders than people who are naturalized citizens. Yeah, there's a higher standard of conduct. And he wasn't meeting that conduct, so he's getting deported, hopefully. I heard that it got blocked. And there should be? Yeah, they should be. And I support this completely. I hope they do this to more of them. We have enough troublemakers in the country already without importing new ones on green cards to start even more trouble. Who needs this?
It's hard to say whether he committed a crime. Whenever there's a neo-Nazi protest, the so-called free speech absolutists come out of the woodwork to defend the legality of that behavior. If they were consistent with that philosophy of law, I would almost respect it. At least there's a seed of something defensible about human freedom in that. But they aren't all consistent. How is it hard to say whether Mahmoud Khalil committed a crime? How can criticizing government policy, foreign or domestic, be a crime? After all, if neo-Nazis were openly criticizing what they perceive to be the role of Jewish people in government policy, it would not even occur to many of these so-called free speech advocates to suggest that there had even been a crime at all. The citizenship or legal residence of the neo-Nazis would not even come up. And before anyone says anything, Nazism is entirely relevant here because policy debate around accepting people coming to this country was fundamentally altered by the United States being complicit in turning away Jewish people fleeing the Holocaust. Jews needed this, and they didn't get it, and that was because of people like Asmongold. This is an issue of the humanity of other human beings. The double standard here is so flagrant that this can be described as nothing less than pure authoritarianism. Asmongold says there's a higher standard of conduct, but that standard is now being imposed. If someone is entitled to the same rights under the American Constitution, then as far as constitutional law has been concerned, there is no higher standard of conduct. He's making that up. But importantly, he views himself as having the power and authority to justify making up the rules as he goes. This is the danger of the actual oppressor consciousness Freire was writing about. It overrides truth. For the authoritarians, the rules are what the authoritarians say they are. I believe this challenge to consciousness, as Freire describes it existing for marginalized groups, is reflected also in how he talks about the situation of people generally. Not because the situation of people affected by what we might call privilege and marginalization, or those targeted by oppression and those who in some form benefit from it, have the same experience, but because they are both adversely affected in some form. There is one last extended quote from Freire that I would like to share here for your consideration. Quote, "But even when the contradiction is resolved authentically by a new situation established by the liberated laborers, the former oppressors do not feel liberated. On the contrary, they genuinely consider themselves to be oppressed. Conditioned by the experience of oppressing others, any situation other than their former seems to them like oppression. Formerly, they could eat, dress, wear shoes, be educated, travel, and hear Beethoven, while millions did not eat, had no clothes or shoes, neither studied nor traveled, much less listened to Beethoven. Any restriction on this way of life in the name of the rights of the community appears to the former oppressors as a profound violation of their individual rights. Although they had no respect for the millions who suffered and died of hunger, pain, sorrow, and despair. For the oppressors, human beings refers only to themselves. Other people are things. For the oppressors, there exists only one right, their right to live in peace, over against the right, not always even recognized, but simply conceded of the oppressed to survival. And they make this concession only because the existence of the oppressed is necessary to their own existence. This behavior, this way of understanding the world and people, which necessarily makes the oppressors resist the installation of a new regime, is explained by their experience as a dominant class. Once a situation of violence and oppression has been established, it engenders an entire way of life and behavior for those caught up in it, oppressors and oppressed alike. Both are submerged in this situation and both bear the marks of oppression. Analysis of existential situations of oppression reveals that their inception lay in an act of violence, initiated by those with power. This violence, as a process, is perpetuated from generation to generation of oppressors, who become its heirs and are shaped in its climate. This climate creates in the oppressor a strongly possessive consciousness, possessive of the world and of men and women. Apart from direct, concrete, material possession of the world and of people, the oppressor consciousness could not understand itself, could not even exist. Fromm said of this consciousness that, without such possession, it would lose contact with the world. The oppressor consciousness tends to transform everything surrounding it into an object of domination. The earth, property, production, the creations of people, people themselves, time, everything is reduced to the status of objects at its disposal." End quote. Remember this idea about possessiveness being a component of oppressor consciousness for later. It's already relevant, but we'll return to it. In light of this quotation, it is little wonder that a nascent reactionary political movement would find it convenient to exploit the possessiveness some people, especially men and white people, might feel towards gaming spaces. Possessiveness, in other words, can guide someone towards an ideology of resentment. If someone's lived experience is structured around their need to have more, or to possess more and more than other groups, then naturally they develop a self-concept that is opposed to the liberties of others. In fact, this is very much akin to the bad faith self-concept many adopt, which is opposed to truth. We'll be looking in brief at two philosophers, how they use the concept of bad faith, and how each example illustrates a key part of the psychological dynamic. The fundamentals of the dishonesty of bad faith rhetoric is perhaps best observed in Jean-Paul Sartre's remarks on anti-Semitism in Anti-Semite and Jew, which run as follows. Quote, "How can one choose to reason falsely? It is because of a longing for impenetrability. The rational man groans as he gropes for truth. He knows that his reasoning is no more than tentative, that other considerations may supervene to cast doubt on it. He never sees very clearly where he is going. He is open, he may even appear to be hesitant. But there are people who are attracted by the durability of a stone. They wish to be massive and impenetrable. They wish not to change. Where indeed would change take them? We have here a basic fear of oneself and of truth." End quote. What Sartre illustrates so perfectly in this quote is fundamental to what it means to be bad faith. Because an egalitarian approach equalizes freedom between all parties, its use in a liberatory framework is humanizing. When human beings are equal before the truth, that at least allows for the potential to avoid oppression. Anti-Semites whose ideology revolves around inflicting social ills on minority groups for their own emotional catharsis do not believe in alleviating oppression for all people, because as people with a fundamentally conservative worldview, they believe freedom exists for the deserving. Valuing unequal distributions of freedom positions some human beings as the betters of others in the eyes of the truth. Consider the earlier example of conservatives approaching the question of pronouns. As Sartre says, quote, "The anti-Semite has chosen hate because hate is a faith. At the outset, he has chosen to devaluate words and reasons." End quote. Hatred, or more generally a sense of inferiority of certain groups, is an a priori value around which some people build their worldview. The truth can be whatever they want. Not all dishonesty is purely intentional. An even better way of saying this is that not all bad faith is lying by design, but rather exists as a lie to oneself that transforms into an inauthentic behavior. In some cases, the knowing liar is not necessarily operating in bad faith at all. Bad faith is a more subtle deception of the self or about the self. Simone de Beauvoir describes this dynamic perfectly in The Second Sex, where she says, quote, "Bad faith in excess leads to the mental asylum. One of the constants of erotomania is that the lover's behavior seems enigmatic and paradoxical. From this slant, the patient's delirium always succeeds in breaking down the resistance of reality. A normal woman sometimes realizes the truth, recognizing that she is no longer loved, but as long as her back is not to the wall, she always cheats a little." End quote. There is a crucial distinction worth making here that few seem to when discussing women's role in misogyny, especially in relationships. To be actively a part of and affirm a culture of misogyny as a woman could be understood as complicity in one's own oppression, but it is often not enough to participate. If one participates in a sexist relationship, one might simply believe that this is one's lot in life, and that while it would be good to have something better, even in a misogynistic situation, a woman must count her blessings. Many women, despite being in the category of what Freire might call the oppressed, neither actively struggle against nor passively resent their limit situation. They instead build for themselves a narrative. Imagine someone like a trad wife, a participant in a largely online phenomenon where women both performatively and truly return to what is seen as a woman's traditional place in the home. The historical reality of this tradition is that it is somewhat recent and non-representative of how most women lived at any point in history, an idea about the past mistaken for its reality, an attempt to live out a mid-20th century advertising campaign. But this is not the source of the trad wife's inauthenticity. Simone de Beauvoir's accounting of the psychological response of women to their limit situation is fundamental to understanding this. In order to approach this issue compassionately, first, please consider, as a humanizing counterexample, a woman in a relationship with a conservative man who had a major public profile. Let's look at the phenomenon of Hillary Crowder, abused ex-wife of conservative pundit Steven Crowder. This is not an unusual story. It is in fact the sad reality of many women on the far right or who marry and date men who are on the far right. Steven Crowder very much existed in the same new media ecosystem as many of the reactionary influencers who spread these talking points about wokeness or DEI, and this ecosystem is totally copacetic with gaming commentators who mostly stick to manufacturing news and doing macro-level culture commentary that redounds to conspiracy thinking. People enter into one community and the YouTube algorithm naturally anticipates that if you're dumb enough to listen and believe the things Grums or Endymion or Shadiversity are telling you, you're probably dumb enough to enjoy the content of a Tim Pool, Matt Walsh, or other such figure. The politics of such men perfectly tee off the right-wing attempt to roll back civil rights for many groups, including and especially immigrants, racial minorities, queer people, and of course women. Accordingly, it does not do to be entirely unsympathetic to women caught in these relationships. Of course, we should not ourselves neglect the facts. Viewers who know of Steven Crowder may be aware of his internet infamous stunts pulled on college campuses as a provocateur. These resulted in the "Change My Mind" meme. Of course, what Steven Crowder was actually doing was baiting engagement with content, where he said things like the original depicted in this Twitter post. Quote, "And here we go, rape culture is a myth, #ChangeMyMind," end quote, with the attached images depicting Crowder sitting at a table with the corresponding phrase displayed on the front. This post seems to have since been deleted from his Twitter. Other examples of Crowder going out of his way to shame and berate women who are already targets of shame and beratement include his diatribe published in 2012 in Fox News' opinion page, where he shames a young couple he met after their wedding night for not choosing abstinence from sex until marriage. Quote, "Do yours the right way. If you're young and wondering whether you should wait, whether you should just give in, become a live-in harlot mimbo and do it the world's way, if you're wondering whether all of the mocking, the ridicule, the incredible difficulty of saving yourself for your spouse is worth it, let me tell you without a doubt that it is. Your wedding can be the most memorable day and night of your life, or just another party. Oops, did I just make a judgment? You're darn right I did." End quote. What's important here is not Crowder's or even his wife's personal life choices, but rather the openness and glee with which he berated others. There's a clear outward presentation of an ideology that victimizes women here, and he isn't the only one. It must feel horrible to be trapped in a marriage with someone like this, especially given that otherwise you love them dearly. But Crowder and many, many right-wing men have long held that no-fault divorce where a woman is allowed to seek divorce without the permission of her husband or the state should be outlawed. I remember a great deal of propaganda around this issue when I was a kid. My school actually had a guest speaker at a very young age, before we were even teenagers, vocally encourage us after a speech with a great deal of shaming and propaganda to sign an abstinence pledge. I had a high school biology teacher give us a lesson where our quote-unquote experiment was getting different cups of colored water and mixing them together with each other until a bunch of our cups were the same dark color, before revealing that this is supposedly how sexually transmitted diseases work, which didn't seem very scientific and made a lot of people uncomfortable. Can someone really be blamed for falling into a situation like this and becoming propagandized? In my opinion, the answer is no. The point of this rhetoric is that it works. It doesn't operate based on goodness, virtue, or even necessarily intelligence or ability. However, writ large, we still have what I would consider an obligation to learn and grow, and this starts with acknowledging what we know is true. The internet is replete with people doing takedowns of women they describe as voting for the leopards eating people's faces party, with the understanding that the leopards aren't going to eat my face, or with the autopsies of trad wives and so-called crunchy influencers. What I mean by bringing up this subject is that it's easy to talk down to someone who we think should have known better. After all, the signs were all there. Literally, the signs were there. But it's hard sometimes to see this problem in ourselves. It might have seemed mysterious that I brought up my grandmother earlier. I mean, why did I do that? Well, part of the reason is obvious or already explained. It's what I've been going through lately, it's influenced my feelings about our culture, and it's fed into my feelings about the importance of good pedagogy. But it's also influenced my views as I've matured about women's issues. My maternal grandmother divorced my maternal grandfather, who passed away when I was in elementary school. The man who I often refer to and see as my grandfather is my mother's stepfather. My mom's family helped raise me. They made me who I am. To be clear, I never heard my grandmother allege any abuse on my grandfather's part, nor will I here do so. I bring this up again to show the relevance of using your voice and developing a sincere engagement with oneself when faced with hardship. It is hard for a woman, perhaps especially of her generation, to divorce her husband. I respect it, even if I don't always know if I fully respect every woman who finds herself in that situation otherwise. What a proper understanding of bad faith as inauthenticity does is help us to heal the contradiction in the worldviews of these women. Beyond any former to extant conservatism in their worldviews, what's notable to most critics is how they really should have seen this coming. This is usually a fast observation for critics of pick-me's. But for all women in situations like this, there exists a sort of self-sacrificial inauthenticity. Returning to the subject of trad wives, they want to be stay-at-home mothers, to exist in what is either proactively or incidentally a conservative aesthetic because it is pleasing to them. It is their choice. To accomplish this, they self-minimize, attaching themselves to men with a seemingly parallel value system which only requires that they meet them halfway. The practical reality, however, is that entering into those relationships is only genuinely desirable if they are contingent upon the woman's consent. The same thing could be said of BDSM and kink. Acting out a specific relationship dynamic can be pleasing, but being forced to remain in that role as not a voluntary submissive but rather a non-consensual slave, that is something else. The implications for the lived realities of these women are clear. Unfortunately, some of these women didn't see it coming. How could they? Their willingness to delete one part of themselves to enhance another part prevented this self-awareness from ever manifesting. Some of them do not leave, do not protest, do not divorce, but rather cling to the inauthenticity, an extension of the original sacrifice. A woman's desire to live as she pleases is achievable with consistency only through her independence and autonomy. To sacrifice one's own independence and autonomy for the sake of acquiring a desirable lifestyle is an erasure of one's own personhood. Non-persons don't make choices. Objects are owned. The contradiction between the desire and the self-denial is a form of inauthenticity. It is bad faith. Conservatives often seem to self-deceive. By affecting the posture of genuinely believing things they're quite aware they could not support with facts, or by denying things they know to be true based on the utility the denial offers. Women in relationships with conservatives, relatively more sympathetic as victims of patriarchal norms, also self-deceive by engaging in self-effacing behavior. What unites these two observations is not merely that both are forms of bad faith reasoning, but also that both represent the two ends of consciousness Freire described, that sense of oppressor consciousness that affects both categories of people, both those at the center and those at the margins of a social dynamic. As best as I can tell, this is the fear of an authentic existence that Freire described in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The landscape we're viewing, therefore, is not just a dishonest sphere of propaganda, but more broadly one where people, in this case audiences built around video games as an art form, are victimized into developing an egoistic identity which either denies others their full humanity or else denies a full humanity to themselves.
No! If only I hadn't discarded so many of my children's trading cards! The most evil thing a person can do! I'm basically Hitler right now!
In May of 2024, when this entire issue lit up the right-wing grifter sphere like a fireworks show, and every racist influencer smelled blood in the water, Mike Drucker wrote a cathartic satirical piece for games journalism website The Gamer. It really drips with a lot of what I can only describe as brooding cynicism about the direction of the industry and all the pathetic botflies breeding in its gaping wounds. With apologies for the visual metaphor, do not Google botflies, I'm not kidding. But Mike Drucker's words have real weight. He sarcastically says, quote, "With thousands of people in the video game industry losing their jobs, including developers who made successful games, I think my energy is best spent elsewhere, namely, making an endless series of 90-minute long videos in which I call every popular piece of media woke unless it features Gina Carano looking straight into the camera and saying slurs." End quote. Truer words have never been spoken. This was seemingly prompted by the conversations, if we could call them that, around Assassin's Creed Shadows, but this has been a problem for a long time. At around the same time, I saw a great Twitter thread from someone else whose work is familiar to me, who talked about the world of games journalism and its problems with real experience. Anna Valens had a lot to say on the subject. She even has a YouTube channel and Twitch you could check out, link in the description. But to me, the standout bit was this. Quote, "Trust in games journalists is at an all-time low. Games journalism websites have tried to get the most bang for their buck with freelancers. This means paying cheap rates while expecting high and fast output from writers, or crunch. The search engine optimization model creates a crunch effect where middling quality guides written by non-experts are squeezed out of writers and sent to pick up search queries on Google. This is fine for casual players, but anyone who is relatively familiar with a game has likely come across one of these guides in the wild, recognized a lack of expertise from the writer in question, and bounced. These writers are usually day one experts, not tried and true fans that write with the diction of someone who has hundreds of hours in a given game, something games media cannot financially support. Meanwhile, news reporting isn't nearly as common these days, nor is it as thorough. As the modern editorial ecosystem treats news as less important than SEO, less long-tail traffic opportunities, just flash-in-the-pan viral search/social interest. News, therefore, requires very fast output to get a return on investment. This results in the public relations summarization effect most mid-tier games journalism outlets struggle with. A trailer/patches public relations copy gets paraphrased, and maybe one paragraph provides additional context. No interviews, no additional analysis, and copy is rushed. So there may be factual inaccuracies. YouTube content creators threaten this. They provide an alternate model for games guides, news, and listicles, because YouTubers have something games journalists don't. Time. A little more of it to refine information and curate the best possible experience. Additionally, many YouTube videos are created by experts driven by passion and high knowledge of a given game, genre, or topic. Compare a Woohoojin Valorant guide to a Dexerto one. Because these creators aren't on an extremely tight schedule, they have more room to let their expertise soar through nuanced analysis. This has made the contemporary games journalism model's problems far more obvious, further harming readers' trust in games journalists. Which isn't journalists' fault, they are being asked to crunch, so the output is poor." End quote. I don't know Mike, but to me this corroborates the frustration I can sense in his article. There are so many problems with games journalism, real problems worth addressing, and a lot of them involve the exploitation of the writers themselves. In light of this, harassment towards these people, especially where bigotry is concerned, can be understood in a new light. This is Karen behavior. This is, I'm gonna get you fired because my burger and fries were cold McMadness. And that's exactly what's happening. Drucker's piece draws attention to layoffs in the industry, and we've recently seen something like this happen with Dragon Age the Veilguard. Electronic Arts, not BioWare itself necessarily, recently published that it had expected the Veilguard to sell 3 million copies as opposed to its actual 1.5 million in sales. This was the expected figure for the first quarter of its release. I'm not a business person, and I don't have insider knowledge of BioWare, nor will I, like some creators, lie to you and pretend that I do. but I do know some things, especially by factual observation. One thing I know is that just because you punish the people who work for them, corporate suits will not necessarily learn their lesson because thanks to you, it wasn't their lesson to learn. It got delegated. In an article for The Gamer, George Foster notes that BioWare is now being restructured in the wake of the perceived failure of the latest Dragon Age title. Personally, this all made me want to see sales numbers for the other games, and there's a Game World Observer article that actually covers this. It seems like EA's expectation were that this game would potentially do as well as Dragon Age Origins, and maybe even breeze past Dragon Age 2. I'm only aware with the fact that the game was reportedly doing rather well on Steam when compared to the company's other games. That, however, would not include Inquisition, owing to the timeline of when EA stopped and started releasing games on Steam again. Again, and this is just a personal observation, but I think the Veilguard hitting around Dragon Age 2's numbers makes a little bit more sense. If it reminds me of any of the other games, it would be that one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Foster notes that many members of the Dragon Age team were laid off altogether, and in corroboration of this, an article for PC Gamer by Ted Litchfield discussing the layoffs states that, as acknowledged by Bloomberg, Electronic Arts has reduced BioWare to a shell of its former self, taking what was once one of the titans of storytelling in the games industry and breaking it down from employing hundreds of people passionate about games to a small group in the double digits. This is how corporations measure the arts, profit. It's also how grifters measure the arts. The people destroying this industry and the people cheering it on don't just have the same motive, they have the same sensibilities. They treat workers the same way, and they have the same amount of care for art and artists, that being functionally zero. The same people who treat critiques of the arts as ratings and recommendations, and who bully everyone who doesn't act like they do, walk hand in hand with the people stripping workers of protections they might have gotten from labor regulations, who denigrate them for asking for greater pay, and who benefit from all of this. I'd like to tell you that this isn't about left or right, but truthfully, besides the fact that the political left has no shortage of unscrupulous collaborators and shifty defectors, there's just no comparison in American culture at the moment. As confirmation of that little nugget of wisdom, let's engage in a thought experiment. Let's say you're a major corporate executive working for Electronic Arts. What is likely to be your takeaway from all of this? Grifters will tell you that the takeaway is just so obvious. Make fewer woke games, where woke means what you personally feel it means. Just don't put so many women and minorities in them, and don't be so nice to the ones that are there. And make them all good, heterosexual, male eye candy. Got it? Well, that's not what's happening. In an article for The Gamer, Tessa Carr notes that, quote, "To hear EA CEO Andrew Wilson tell it, it's because the Veilguard wasn't a live service game. During a recent financial call, Wilson said, quote, in order to break beyond the core audience, games need to directly connect to the evolving demands of players who increasingly seek shared world features and deeper engagement alongside high-quality narratives. It did not resonate with a broad enough audience in this highly competitive market," end quote. Let me be crystal clear. I don't blame the people who didn't play or didn't like the game for this. That's a rhetorical tool grifters use, conflating the fanbase or audience generally with their weird stuck-up Karen tendencies or bigoted biases. I do think some of that was going around, but that's not my point. When corporate suits hear phrases like high-quality narratives, they take that in a meta-level sense. To them, this could be anything. Like how technically if you're playing Overwatch 2, your narrative as a player is your struggle to get unstuck from bronze. I'm not kidding. That's how these people think, and here you have it on full display. That means when they say narrative, they might just give you another live service game. They are not learning the lesson you think they are. You cannot punish these people into doing the right thing. They are fully wrapped up in their own market ideology and world of spreadsheets. So, what are we to do when advocating for a world with good games in it that we can actually enjoy because we're not grifters and we're not corporate suits? Well, one thing we could start with is listening to the creative people who actually do the work. What are they saying? Somewhat recently, as of the writing of this video, I saw an article by Stevie Bonifield for PC Gamer that covered the Horizon Forbidden West controversy, where the company behind the game ran a tech demo with a stiff AI Aloy imitation of the game's player character. I've seen more anti-woke gamers call this character fat and hairy and ugly and insinuate she's part of an agenda than I've seen them call this sort of thing out, which seems intentional to me. Ashley Birch, the actress in question, doesn't even take this opportunity to take issue with the technology, stating her actual issue is with the way the rollout of this technology in context could be used to undermine labor regulations, which again, seems like it would have to be intentional. But allow me to be Will Smith here. If you argue with people about generative AI, which is just another corporate branding technique, disguising crude, large language models that cost way too much money and energy to prop up for not nearly enough content output, you'll meet with some of the most disingenuous people alive. I have, as a disabled writer, had proponents of Gen AI LLMs tell me I don't actually care about disabled artists because they want to cast the ability to tell a machine to create something whole cloth for them while they slap their name on it as equally the same thing as what artists do. The real issue I have with this technology is nuanced, but importantly, if you're a disabled writer, instead of telling a machine created by a corporation and trained non-consensually on the work of other writers to do something for you, you could simply keep trying. I've seen people talk about their ADHD and how it makes it harder to read or write, and contrary to what you might think, I'm sympathetic to that because it's also my lived experience. But you'll notice that I did write all of this. Every word you're hearing in this video was written by me, either transcribed from an article, book, or video, or written from my own mind. Of course, there are no entirely original thoughts. Can a program create a beautiful symphony? Can I? These are the wrong questions. But this essay, you will note, is about what the point of art even is, and frankly, I find the implication that the point of art is to create pure outputs that please the audience entirely disgusting. Nietzsche understood that art had a deeper function as a stimulus to life. It spoke to human civilization. It was conditioned by and went on to condition our notions of ourselves. That is what I understand culture to be, not the art itself, but what it expresses, that of which it is an extension and a constitutive atom. And so art as the purely didactic moral and art as the purely aesthetic pleasure are both bankrupt and impossible. The mechanization of the reproduction of the arts and their production for exchange has created what people sometimes call slop, art as corporate product. But at least when human beings are forced to rely on their own consciousness to make it, there is still great opportunity for human consciousness to express itself. But these text and image LLMs are pure, exclusive slot machines, ordaining production around dead, captured consciousness the same way capitalism ordains production more generally around dead labor produced for exchange. Why is it that these LLM models, when told to produce an image of a beautiful woman, are more likely to show you a white woman? Why is it that they default to certain styles, looks, and appearances at all? Why do they tend to use certain stock phrases? Why do they fabricate completely inaccurate information like this court case reported on by AP News? Even the judge in this case thought the lawyers who got caught using ChatGPT to invent fake citations were acting in bad faith, and given my interactions with proponents of AI LLMs, I have to lend this some credence. I've become an extreme cynic on this issue for a few reasons. The harm it could cause to artists and the absolute disingenuity of the arguments people make in defense for their use of the technology are just two reasons. There's no moral grounding here. Credible reports have come out about these companies using workers in the global south paid absolute slave wages to do, as always, the grunt work of major corporations around the world, this time training these machines to better replicate the outputs corporations want their products to make. This is rotten. I cannot imagine as a disabled artist making the argument that the real problem here is capitalism. That's like saying the problem with feudalism is that it's patriarchal. Granted, that's a part of the issue, but if you are still doing this labor exploitation for means other than production for exchange, it would still be wrong. And this brings me back to my point about disability as a writer. I can talk all day about the ways struggling with my mental and physical health has made things difficult for me. It creates pain, shame, distance between myself and others, opportunities for people to take advantage of me, and of course financial immiseration. But what it doesn't do is entitle me to own or rent slaves. This will always be wrong. And I know that there will be some people who just can't help themselves. Hi, you're in the wrong place. But no, I'm not moralizing about a thing we already do with everything else. I'm talking about production, not possession. A lot of the things you own were made with some form of unethical labor. If you found a printout of an AI-generated image on the side of the road, I wouldn't moralize to you about picking it up. If you built, maintained, or defended the use of the machine that made it, that would be a different story. I'm also not necessarily talking at all about neural networks or all programs artists use to help generate digital objects or effects. There are real tools that creatives and yes, people with language barriers and disabilities or any other obstacles could get use out of, and in addition to that fact, we should strive to make them better and more ethical. But there are limitations to just recontextualizing a tool, and these conflations are dangerous. And these limitations and distinctions matter because they brush up on the ethical stances we would even use to begin to object to systems of exploitation. Again, I'm not going to yell at anyone who has ever played around with one of those text and image generators, or who has ever used a translator or a voice changer with technologies like this. In fact, if you want to go to people and talk to them about it, being more encouraging of them making their own things and growing in their own abilities, or collaborating with others, might actually be a better way, especially if they're not too dedicated to defending this stuff. Please, as always, don't use this section of this video, or any of this video, as an excuse to harass anyone. It doesn't help. I always think the more ethical option is better, and I know it sounds like I'm lecturing, but it's always going to sound like that when someone takes a hard stance on an issue like this, and I think taking that stance matters. If you're going to take issue with capitalism, you're going to take issue with a lot of these corporations and their generative AI LLMs. This is not a capitalism bad video, at least not in the sense that I can wrap everything up in that nice little bow. Capitalism is a machine that eats. Capital is a gangrenous rot consuming all human endeavor, and these programs are just an extension of that. I am tired of this conversation about AI as an artist, but also as someone who cares about the truth. The disingenuity has to stop, and I am drawing a line on this. If you are going to make disingenuous arguments in defense of this stuff, you are running interference for exploitation in the same way these conservative grifters are. And the behavior doesn't become okay just because you think of yourself as left-wing. I don't want to hear your hot take about it. Keep it to yourself. Hopefully that last point also makes clear that what I'm doing in this essay isn't acting as a partisan propagandist, but rather taking issues that have become partisan topics seriously. We need to listen to artists, not the people taking advantage of them. That's the point. That's the entire point. Going back to the BioWare example, what's the lesson here? A couple different articles cropped up reporting on different figures from BioWare and the industry generally for strong takeaways. David Gator, responsible for much of the work people have praised as the basis for the Dragon Age series, a great deal of which I have written about in video essays for my patrons at patreon.com, openly said that these companies should follow the example of Baldur's Gate 3. And what did Larian Studios CEO Sven Finke say about Baldur's Gate 3? In a rare moment of sanity, I get to agree with a corporate executive, although I'm still thanking Gator for knowing the difference. Because Finke said it was stupidly simple, and that the studio made their game because they wanted to make a game they wanted to play themselves. They didn't make it to increase market shares. They didn't make it to serve a brand. They didn't have to meet arbitrary sales targets, or fear being laid off if they didn't meet those targets. Well, if that's stupidly simple, ideally anyone could understand it. For more commentaries on EA CEO Andrew Wilson's remarks, we can go to how former Dragon Age creative director Mike Laidlaw responded. Quote, "Look, I'm not a fancy CEO guy, but if someone said to me the key to this successful single-player IP's success is to make it purely a multiplayer game, no, not a spin-off, fundamentally change the DNA of what people loved about the core game, to me, I'd probably, quit that job or something," end quote. It's a pretty damning acknowledgement. It seems like creative freedom is the only way to go, and I think that makes sense. But the response to, and I'm straining my ability to be charitable here, not enjoying a few elements of the Veilguard's writing appears to be to say that beyond those specific pieces of writing, the writers themselves must be bad. You can see how this mindset gets twisted into not merely refusing to acknowledge layoffs, but actively supporting them. All of this is, of course, in spite of how much of the negativity over the writing was targeted at Tosh, written by Trick Weeks, who also wrote Cole, Krem, Solus, and the Iron Bull in Dragon Age Inquisition. Two of which are especially funny given that one argument grifters have used is that prior transgender representation like Krem and prior Qunari characters like Bull were so much better written that the Veilguard writers must just not be as good as those other writers. I've even seen people suggest that the writers behind Tosh must just not understand Qunari lore. Yeah, sure thing, pal. Weeks also wrote a whole host of fan-favorite Mass Effect characters in Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3. Real members of the fandom have been pointing this out on social media, but tourists don't care. I've read Weeks' writing. I've even reviewed some of it on my Patreon. And speaking as a writer, I think the most modest word I would use is competent. They know what they're doing, even if you happen to not like one thing they made. All of these dimensions collapse into a single issue when you realize the connection. The article that has been passed around used as a source by YouTubers, internet commentators, and critics, not to mention other publications, to evidence the downfall of BioWare and the Dragon Age team via the Veilguard, comes from the aforementioned Bloomberg article. The reporting doesn't even support the position many people have taken, that the Veilguard is itself responsible for the majority of EA's losses. If anything, there seems to be reason to believe most of those losses are the result of FIFA's performance, and the long-term performance of the Veilguard is still expected to be positive. However, you may, or may not, have seen this Business Wire article covering in brief the aims of Electronic Arts in September 2024, about a month and a half from the Veilguard's release. These comments come from the Electronic Arts Investor Day on last September 17th. The website hosted by Electronic Arts has the slideshow for the event. A couple slides are relevant here. There was some discussion of the Veilguard, obviously with relevance to anticipation of the release, which had yet to occur, but previously a different speaker had the chance to describe some of the future potential of Electronic Arts. And behold, here again we have Andrew Wilson, now hawking generative AI, this bad marketing gimmick lingering as a malicious opportunity for the same people that its evangelists claim to be fighting. I think the juxtaposition speaks for itself. Why is this relevant? Well, this is the playbook. Exploit the vulnerabilities of games journalism for content. Control the narrative by proximity to major, massively overfunded new media outlets and figures. Flood the zone with as much content spamming the same toxic commentaries to win people over by sheer volume and rote inculcation to the narrative, and then weaponize the audience of the newly minted anti-woke propaganda machine to make a series of self-fulfilling prophecies. It's all get woke, go broke until it isn't, but that's okay because it's not a prophecy, it's an incantation. Anti-woke hucksters will say it until it comes true, and they will send their fans like rabid hordes of flying monkeys to harass and defame and smear until the job gets done. They don't like the people working on these games. They don't like the artists. They're not even that fond of you, since they disingenuously play to the gallery by waxing poetic about the good old days of gaming, while they simultaneously weaponize their audience to make sure the people who made those good old games you miss lose their jobs and are out of work. I don't know if I, outside the content I'm making for my Patreon, will ever make a video where I actually go about making my critiques of Dragon Age the Veilguard. And of course, as a fan of the series who is at least occasionally capable of being normal about women and minorities, this seems to be by design. Again, there's the incantation. Grifters will say real fans think this, or the real fans think that, when fans generally are a diverse group with diverse opinions, unless you bully people out of a social space a lot of the larger anti-woke figures have little to no interest in to begin with. Ironically, these people I term grifters here because they are weaponizing a hobby-related space to propagandistically inculcate their audience using rhetoric, deception, and bullying, could not do this alone. The little men of these movements, to borrow a phrase from Milton Mayer, get to exert their petty tyranny over social spaces because they've been given permission to do so. It's an expression at times of catharsis, which, while not necessary to these people as human beings, is still addicting because it hijacks a real need for social validation and a real pain felt from societal failings. The hijacked process of social injury and social validation becomes an exploitative cycle, where the new treatment for the condition becomes also a new affliction, and now breaking out of the space is like replacing a friend, or a home, or a prescription. Breaking this cycle is important. I have faith in artists and the arts, not in weaponized fan identity. But it matters that there are actual people out there who really do care and who are using their voices to speak up on this issue.
I knew you couldn't resist my charm. All right, if you defeat me, then your grandpa walks. If you lose, we go on a date.
All right, that's it. I've heard just about enough out of you, Toots.
It's time to start drawing together everything we've discussed so far. Propaganda around market success, the purpose of the arts, bigoted biasing commentary, bad faith argumentation, and the importance of caring about artists and the arts. First things first now. I'm not even the first person to notice that these anti-woke commentators fudge the numbers and the facts out of a combination of wishful thinking and willingness to mislead their audiences. Here's a clip from DJ over at the Eric Debunks channel wherein he discusses Nerdrotic finally acknowledging something DJ has been pointing out to his fans for some time, specifically that Nerdrotic's claim that Disney could be faking the budgets published for their films was full of holes.
I want you guys to understand that is not how business works. Investors would not write blank checks to Disney and just allow them to go out like a credit card and run up funds for an inflated budget on a film. That's not going to happen. That's what producers are there for. They are there on set in meetings to make sure the production budget stays on task and that if it goes over, it is documented as going over. Why would Disney announce an overage in budgets for some movies but not all movies? The answer is they wouldn't. They wouldn't do that. There's lots of legal reasons. I'm just going to go over the legal reasons here, and then we're going to talk in more detail about my thoughts on all of this. So the first big one, if they lie about the budget, is an SEC violation, securities fraud. If Disney knowingly reports false financial information about a film's budget, it could be considered security fraud under U.S. law. The SEC requires publicly traded companies, and Disney is a publicly traded company, to provide accurate financial disclosures, and misrepresenting expenses could lead to penalties. That's just number one. That applies directly to what they're doing here. So if investors out there find out that they're reporting false information, it is literally an SEC violation. It's also tax fraud. If a company inflates or deflates a film's budget to improperly claim tax credits, deductions, or incentives, it could face tax fraud charges. Many film incentives require an accurate budget reporting, and misrepresentation could lead to audits, fines, or criminal charges.
There's more to that clip, and I'll link it in the description for anyone interested. But the long and short of it is that if I was Gary of the channel Nerdrotic and I wanted to accuse Disney of doing something shady, I would maybe not accuse them of potentially doing the type of thing the government used to get Al Capone. I might be crazy enough to take on the Grifters sphere, but the IRS? No thank you. I suppose it doesn't really matter because a core of what makes someone a grifter is the dedication to twisting the truth. DJ actually described this perfectly in another recent video.
And I'm sure people will be in the comment, well, what makes them grifter, whatever. They're grifters because they are purposely creating misleading content and hate content just to get views. They are selling you outrage. That's all they're doing. They're creating videos for you to stay mad about stuff. And they make enough of them at a rapid rate that you can spend all day just flipping through all of these guys' channels and just being perpetually mad about stuff. Just ask the people that have broken away from these guys and seen some of the shows and movies they said are bad. And they're like, well, they weren't actually that bad, but these guys told me they were bad, so I didn't watch them. Start thinking for your fucking self.
The guys at the Fandom Initiative helped me recontextualize some of the things I've been seeing from what they sometimes alternatively call the Chud or Grifter sphere. Previously, in ye olde first Trump era and prior, that sphere probably would have been labeled as part of the manosphere. Keeping all the context in mind is important to me. I'm really thankful to DJ and the rest of the guys for that. Dane of Actual Fandom on YouTube also put me onto another creator a while back who was making videos which, to borrow his phrase, exposed the grift. I am of course talking about the Birdman, who I was sort of familiar with due to seeing some of his CinemaSins responses forever ago, but I hadn't seen his Go Woke, Go Broke video and felt it made a really compelling point in summary.
First of all, the assertion that companies go broke by going woke is not supported by empirical evidence. On the contrary, many companies that adopt progressive, inclusive policies experience sustained or greater financial success and positive public perception. Nike featured Colin Kaepernick in an ad in 2018, and although it was controversial, Nike saw sales grow by 31% the next weekend, and its stock reached an all-time high within weeks. Apple is very obviously committed to inclusivity and diversity, and it remains the most valuable company on earth. Netflix has diversity initiatives, and, well, I think this chart speaks for itself. Needless to say, there are countless examples of companies adopting progressive policies, and the terminally online but loud minority that espouse this mantra have no idea what they're talking about. But you're probably thinking, well, those aren't movies. What about movies? And I was thinking,
You know how long I've been waiting for this? Woo, I'm about to make a name for myself here.
Crazy Rich Asians, one of the few major Hollywood films with an all-Asian cast, budget of $30 million, grossed $238 million. Get Out, a film focused exclusively on how white people use black people for their own aims, budget of $4.5 million, grossed $255 million. Zootopia, an animated film with themes about prejudice, stereotypes, and inclusion, budget of $150 million, grossed $1 billion. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, a film about the welfare of animals and constructing the perfect race, which also features a character that is gender-swapped and a character that is race-swapped. Budget of $250 million, grossed $846 million. Hidden Figures, a historical film depicting the black women that helped send man to the moon. Budget of $25 million, gross of $236 million. Barbie, an obviously feminist film that features a transgender Barbie. Budget of $145 million and a gross of $1.4 billion.
I can't stop winning.
Wonder Woman, a film about the feminist icon with themes of female empowerment, budget of $149 million, gross of $824 million. Black Panther and its sequel, I think you get the point.
Obviously, woke films and other business ventures can be quite profitable at times. I was aware of the majority of the examples the Birdman cites in his video, as well as this larger cultural conversation about progressive themes and representation in films, especially because over the years, discussions around corporate pinkwashing, corporate and police presence at pride parades, and other similar topics became commonplace in the lettuce, gay bacon, and tomatoes community here in the United States of America. As a denizen of the LGTV community myself, I've always cared about this in proportion to how much of an issue it felt like it was. Not the biggest thing, but worth the occasional acknowledgement. As time went on, I started to hear more and more from increasingly right-wing parrots, to borrow another phrase from the Birdman, that companies didn't really care about gay or trans people. They would just acquiesce to allow us to be put in stuff because it was profitable for them. I always felt a bit of confusion hearing this because it was common knowledge in our community, and is probably even more common knowledge to anyone who understands capitalism even a little. It reminds me of when I was a kid growing up Catholic, and I got to hear a lot from Christians around me how if they opposed gay marriage, it was because of their religious reasons, not that they were bigoted. Of course, this isn't really comforting to hear if you're a part of one of these groups, because if somebody treats you as a second-class citizen, the way they justify it is far less important than how it affects you. And ultimately, the fact that the church had told them so, or that they read it in a book which is neither a work of history nor scientific literature, isn't all that comforting either. Suffice it to say that, like so much of what we've discussed here, these experiences have taught me that the people saying these things mean something else by them. Like with the earlier example of how these people seem to mean get woke, go broke as a mantra, or how they will sometimes refuse to acknowledge the existence of pronouns, it seems like being able to condescend to marginalized groups about representation in and of itself does something for them. As always, this looks like another form of self-soothing. They're making themselves a quiet little promise. It's only profitable for now, but soon we'll wrench the system in our favor, and then things won't be so easy for you. As always, plausible deniability is key, which is why bad faith rhetoric is so necessary for these people. Of course, they keep jumping the shark, but by inculcating their audiences to their behavior and sentiments, a lot of stuff probably starts to feel more reasonable and normal. Take, for example, this reaction the Birdman got to his content.
The film's protagonist and his love interest, a black man and an Asian woman, respectively, are relatively unique in big Hollywood productions, something I took note of in my own review of the film.
Not really.
Mainly because I've been writing my own story featuring those same demographics.
Not really, because that's the DEI bullshit of race mixing.
That's the DEI bullshit of race mixing. you're probably starting to understand why I consider him the most annoying so far. This motherfucker just sat here and said a hiring practice is responsible for race mixing. A hiring practice. I think these people forget what DEI actually stands for, and it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, this is the basis for diversity training in a business.
Now, to be completely fair to that member of the German master race, probably he was just confused and wanted to listen to his favorite band, DEI N-word. I'm sure it's an accident that he implied he thought there was some kind of conspiracy to push race mixing or that he was against it. In all seriousness, I just wanted to include this clip because while it is yet another shark jump moment, it's important to put a lot of these things in context. If you're a creator from any kind of marginalized group and you factually, accurately call out this nonsense, this is the type of stuff that people will say to you. And not just random commenters, although that tends to happen online, but these anti-woke grifters will do this exact type of thing as well, replete with all the logical and evidentiary problems we've noted in this essay. Speaking of evidence, while I did study Japanese in college, mine is somewhere between rusty to non-existent, so my ability to evaluate evidence given in Japanese was somewhat limited. And you know, right-wing weebs were having a field day with these algorithmically generated controversies, so I had originally wanted to include the Birdman to mention that his videos about Assassin's Creed Shadows were super helpful to me. If you look closely at the image on your screen, you'll see yet another right-wing MAGA account piggybacking off this discourse, naturally by quote-tweeting Grums. None of these people are remarkable, but the individual in the attached video clip who is commenting on the Japanese National Diet, their legislature, is of interest. This man's name is Shohei Kondo, and he has become rather infamous for latching onto discourses and getting into fights with other creators like the Hidden One or the Birdman himself. It's all basically concocted by Shohei for clicks, but people have started pointing out online that the lies Shohei and others have been spreading are not accurate. In relative terms, Shohei might look like a less offensive figure compared to some of the people I've brought up in this essay, but it's important to bring up that what he's doing feeds the narratives of Western racists, and furthermore, the material he's spread has proliferated, and in the larger conversation it has been used to lie to large numbers of people in ways that even scholars have been speaking up about. I'll also link the Birdman's video in the description so everyone can check it out, but because of something I mentioned earlier, I imagine someone in the comments will bring up the article quotation that mentions Thomas Lockley. I've buried the lead a little bit here, but this is a YouTube video essay and not an article, so if you commented before watching, hey, that's on you. I hand things off one final time to the Birdman.
Further, there is a Japanese children's book published in 1968 called Kurosuke. This book clearly depicts Yasuke as a warrior with a sword working for Nobunaga.
Yes, this is fiction, and it's kinda new after World War II.
Yeah, no shit. If you let the rest of the video play, I state that this book is the first time someone depicts Yasuke as a warrior in literature, which predates Wikipedia for all the morons trying to say we have gotten our information from Thomas Lockley, a person I have never brought up. This book is 33 years older than Wikipedia and was written by a Japanese man, showing that Yasuke as Bushi is not the creation of Westerners.
As right-wing parrots across the Grifterverse have dedicated themselves to pointing out, Thomas Lockley himself admits we only have a very small amount of information about Yasuke. Thankfully, the quote I used from him earlier is restricted to the very small amount of descriptive remarks that would be defensible in this context. Depicting Yasuke as some sort of samurai or bushi is totally reasonable in the context of him openly carrying a sword alone, but it doesn't matter because this clearly only became controversial when a bunch of mostly white, mostly Western people decided it was, as the other examples of portrayals of Yasuke show. The other Assassin's Creed games also purported to be historically accurate, but if meeting God is less far-fetched to you than a competent black man rising above slavery in feudal Japan, I guess you're in the right movement. But the previous point was that this is supposedly offensive to Japanese people, who not only seem by and large unbothered, but also actually came up with the idea of depicting Yasuke as a samurai-type figure, or bushi meaning warrior. There is no problem here, and frankly, I show you many of these clips of creators and users and writers with whom I agree to make the point that other people see this too. In fact, while I was working on this video, a video from fellow small queer gaming and culture YouTuber Crimes New Roman dropped, and it covers what you might call the anti-woke gaming propaganda pipeline, especially how Asmongold's community was hijacked by politically motivated racists and other such hateful individuals. A personal favorite element of this video is the way Noah discusses the Alyssa Mercante lawsuit that Smash JT was panicking about a while back. Overall, they're more fair and charitable to a lot of the guys getting sucked into these hate movements than I am. I don't tend to be oriented around that because a lot of this white and/or male and/or Christian grievance culture is fundamentally geared towards stroking the egos of the people who get trapped in that content loop, and so dignifying them can have mixed results, especially when their pattern is to attack you in very strong terms, call in their backup dancers or backseat gamers, if you will, and try to force the 1v3, 1v4, or even 1v5 like they're the world's sweatiest Elden Ring gank squad. It's like love bombing, but the guy doing it to you is someone you'd notice being loud at a bus stop because they're drunk on a weekday. But Noah makes some really stellar points here, and I'd like to share just one clip now.
Who wants to learn a fun new term? Oh boy, so exciting! First off, what you saw when I searched YouTube and Google is an example of a data void. Unfortunately, it's not nearly as cool as the name suggests, and actually, quite terrible. There are a handful of different ways that these work, but this instance is when people create new terms or build strategically optimized information ecosystems around them before those terms become mainstream and open to more credible sources, if ever. In this instance, what that means is if people like this decide to abuse SEO and search terms around her name, they can fill this data void that doesn't have anything in it with whatever they want. So new people who search for her name will only find one-sided spam like this. Funny how the both sides crowd always seems to be pretty quiet with things like this,
This data voiding, as strategic search engine optimization and malicious discourse farming, is key to understanding the anti-woke movement in all its facets. I described earlier how terms like woke, DEI, and before them also things like affirmative action became right-wing dog whistles. We've seen this also with CRT, or critical race theory, if you were under a rock for a couple of years there. It's okay, I get it. I'm like Batman, I live in my cave. But importantly, this is completely astroturfed, and infamously not just by conservative groups like Turning Point USA, but also by figures like Chris Rufo and James Lindsay, who you may remember from the CRT panic a number of years ago. A lot of these guys are using definitive but personal and frequently mutually exclusive definitions of woke, DEI, or CRT, but they tend to agree generally about those things and barely argue with each other over their definitions, because they're all functionally interchangeable by virtue of orbiting the manufactured conceptual sovereignty. These guys don't care how recently a video game series was woke, or how recently the black culture use cases of woke were the only dominant use cases, because it's all about them, about when they encountered these topics and their ecosystem. I think a lot of this content is geared towards finding avenues not to avoid confronting, but rather to actively dismiss facts, logic, and argumentation from someone like myself. It's one of the reasons why I get a not infrequent stream of comments from people who think and act in ways I've criticized in this essay, but who say things like, "I knew I could stop paying attention when I heard you say you were a feminist," or "I stopped listening when I heard commie bullshit," or otherwise just rephrase an argument I address in the video without addressing the way I addressed it. A lot of this is about ego and the self, yes, and not just in the ways I've described here, but it's also about protecting oneself from what one dare not know, to borrow a phrase from Matthew Stover. I see a suspicious number of people proud of learning to tune out, disregard, or discount views with which they're nevertheless intent on engaging. I've used broad language like these people and this movement in this video because, at the end of the day, I don't think the people trapped in these content cycles are just victims. Some of them are also a part of the problem, and very actively so. They learn readily from those they orbit to disregard, disengage, and disassemble. They disregard those whose views it would be inconvenient to understand. Then they disengage when confronted with those views, and then they disassemble those views without ever reconstructing them, cutting off sentences and rearranging the wording of tweets, and putting so many words in people's mouths you'd think they were spelunking in your esophagus. All that's left at the end is safety, and that sounds nice, but what you're keeping yourself safe from is a necessary change. You're stunting your growth, and worse, you're making it everybody else's problem. It feels like this is everything now. Every game that comes out, we go through the same goofy discourse cycle, regardless of the facts of the situation in any direction. People with previously limited to no investment in a topic will suddenly be pretending to be experts. I knew about Yasuke not only through pop culture, but because my history of modern Japan professor at my university brought him up briefly during our coursework. None of this was surprising to me, but it doesn't matter. I've reoriented my discussion of this topic around what's actually happening. Pure rhetoric and deception, and what actually matters, namely the arts, the industry, and people. I've anticipated a lot of the rhetoric you'll see out in the wild during these discourses, and so I expect this essay to stand the test of time. But there's one final argument I'll warn you about. You're not unlikely to see it here in this comment section or on other videos and posts calling this stuff out. I saw it recently in a Michael Hobbs thread discussing some recent discourse reignited in a New York Times article about the lab leak theory of the COVID-19 pandemic, a theory which, while not technically impossible, asks the reader to overlook not only an absence of evidence, but also the much simpler explanation of incidental cross-species transmission, a thing that happens all the time. The NYT article was itself pure rhetoric, but while it was being refuted, this guy popped up in the replies. It's the last resort of someone defending a lie. Equivocation. You say there's no evidence for this, you say they're lying, but also you have beliefs, so you're the same, actually. This is only correct if you think there's necessarily no difference if something is true or untrue. If it's possible one person is deceiving or acting disingenuously in bad faith, then equivocation showcases a dangerous disregard for the truth. I've had people do this to me before, high on their own farts, jacking themselves raw with their enlightened centrism. Obviously, if two people disagree, but one person has to lie to make a point, and the other one doesn't, they're not doing the same thing. Equivocation is the resort of a stupid and delusional person trying to save face. Speaking of Michael Hobbs, he co-hosts a podcast with Peter Shamshiri, who recently wrote a piece called What Happens to the Free Speech Warriors, which touches on a current I've maintained throughout this essay. It was in what I said earlier about the arc that figures like Charlie Kirk and organizations like Turning Point USA feeding this astroturfing of right-wing crusades. It was in what I mentioned about Asmongold's sheer hypocrisy on the case of Mahmoud Khalil. It was in the strategies, tactics, and tools from right-wing grifters that we've seen on display here. There's something about these discourse cycles that suggests a little bit more than innocence and a little bit less than intentionality. An unaware strategy that has the form of malice and the effect of a distinction without a difference. It's moments like those that you can be sure bad faith is at play, and we've seen it. Like bad faith journalists, bad faith social media agitators will often opine about how ridiculous it is to compare them to fascists. I mean, come on, they're nothing like those guys, you're being ridiculous. But you could say the same thing about the trad wives and the crunchy wives and other such similar women, right? If anything, they're some of the victims of these patriarchal men. But we know from de Beauvoir that sometimes women can actually acquire a sense of power where before she might have felt disempowered in her situation, and this can be done by cozying up to male power. You could map this onto any class relation dynamic. Just like a woman who receives her power through and not in spite of an authoritarian father can cause harm to her children and the family, a media landscape that receives its power through and not in spite of an authoritarian political movement can cause harm to everyone under the state. They're siding with our victimizers and inviting us to be the next ones to do so. These tactics, this rhetoric, it's also manipulative, as if it were created in a lab to undermine our ability to engage with each other constructively and sincerely. Maybe it was. But more likely, these collaborators and collaborative structures emerge from common root causes that surround and overwhelm us. It can be hard to imagine how even to begin to respond to that. The propagandists always have the advantage of malice, bad faith, and structures of power. But we have an advantage. We can learn and understand the strategies, so next time, we'll recognize the rhetoric when we see it. If this is exhausting to you, you are not alone, and there are other people pushing back. It can be depressing, really, as someone who cares about the arts, to even bother to engage. I know a lot of people think there's no point in talking about this stuff. I don't really see myself as fighting back against the people who farm reactionary outrage for clicks, but more so as trying to create a more thoughtful atmosphere. If you don't take the time to think more deeply about things like this, one day life may have just passed you by. and you'll realize that you didn't bother because you were too busy indulging some other feeling. That's actually why I wanted to make this video. I've given probably too much time in my one precious life to doing my best to thoughtfully engage with some of the most dedicated liars the internet has to provide, and what do I have to show for it? Well, maybe not nothing. Looking over everything I've had the chance to bring up in this video, I have to say I think I've improved my posture towards the issues and my willingness to learn somewhat. I've also developed a more accurate vocabulary for what it is that I'm seeing, which I've done my best in previous sections of this video to try and proliferate here. I've also gained some new perspective on humanity and on life, and especially on the arts. In some of the darkest times that I've had lately, one of the only things that has kept me holding on, sometimes my one singular foothold among the living, has been art. Literature especially, but also films and paintings and, yeah, video games too. It's important to me that throughout all of this essay retains its essential character. As with a lot of the stuff that I make, the point is not to bludgeon you into agreeing with my politics, as stubborn as I know I can be, but to make you think. Thinking is necessary. That might sound simplistic and even trite, but it's an important truth. The ability to make choices, the ability to discover and create and build, is less a function of the question of free will versus deterministic micro-level human impulses than they are a function of the unity of actively humanized individuals participating in human traditions to keep what is fundamental to human expression alive. This is an existential question about meaning and social consciousness. Over the heads of every member of every society across all periods of civilization hangs the invisible cloud of human consciousness. The reason authoritarians of all stripes exert first a determination of who gets to be human, thus enforcing a prejudice of who the proper inheritors of our species, our eras, our societies, and our traditions are allowed to be, is that it is first necessary for them to control consciousness. Thought is a function of consciousness, not merely an individual's, but the component relationship between the individual and the collective. I stress this is my philosophical view, but it is informed by spending years following all of these unfolding discourses very closely and sincerely attempting to map their happenings with our philosophy. If you don't think, thoughts will be determined for you entirely. If you don't defend consciousness, your contact with our social consciousness will be controlled. These are, in fact, one singular phenomenon. I felt it necessary in an earlier part of this essay to ground everything I was about to talk about in philosophy around social issues, and before that, in concrete experiences of people, and how the arts help us to express them, and even before that, in death. Maybe it's the romanticism in me, maybe it's just that I was a morbid kid, or maybe it's that I've had a lot of struggles with mental health over the years, and more recently with physical health, but there's something about death that speaks in my mind to the need to create. Human life is fragile. Diversity isn't some political agenda to create the Soviet states of America, which sounds stupid, but it's how people talk sometimes. But instead, it's something more precious. It's life in the process of unfolding. The humanities is a fragile ecosystem, and just as some death in the experience of individual living things continues to feed it, too much death can annihilate it. What do we do when we're facing that level of destruction? How can we recover? How can we endure? I'm not even sure I know the right question to ask. I've talked a lot here, too much in general, but especially a lot about people I don't know and probably will never meet, including some I'll never have the chance to meet but wish I could one day. One person I did have the chance to meet and know, however, is my grandmother. And while she wasn't able to talk to me for years before she passed away, I have my memories of her. I knew her. I think I know that she would be just as uncertain about the future as I am. I don't know if she would have any clear answers about what I'm supposed to do now, how I'm supposed to keep going, not just in the broader cultural landscape, but through very real concrete problems. I do, however, think I know what she would say, because I knew her. I think she would tell me that somehow I was going to find a way, and if that's good enough for her, it's good enough for me. The arts give meaning to life lived and life lost, and to quote a very famous Dragon Ball Z scene, "It is because you cherish life that you must protect it." I would like here to acknowledge everyone that helped make this video essay possible. Thank you immensely to all of my patrons. Without your direct financial support, I do not know if I would have gotten this far to begin with. You continue to help make this possible. A huge thank you also to my subscribers, viewers, commenters, community members, and Discord members and personal friends for their feedback, attention, and emotional support. I make this stuff for you guys, so if it matters to you, that matters to me. I'd like to thank the members of the Fandom Initiative for giving me a lot of help in curating some of the sources used in the 4th section of this essay, as well as my friends at the Nomad Archive, Animal Anatomy Discord, and my friendly neighborhood library sciences expert Cinco Zexen for all of their help in finding published work and making it accessible to me. I'd like to personally thank my mother and grandfather for passing along some of my grandmother's things for my consideration, especially old pictures and one of her essays about her time as an educator, which has informed my worldview and will continue to do so as long as I live. I invite you all to be curious in your posture, rigorous in your reasoning, fearless in your pursuits, and kind in your hearts. Thank you.